Sex sits at the center of human existence, yet philosophy has largely treated it with suspicion. For 2,000 years, Western thinkers viewed sexual desire as dangerous, degrading, or merely animal. Plato argued that bodily desires distract us from higher truths about beauty and goodness. Augustine claimed sexual pleasure threatens to master our rational will and corrupt the soul. Kant called sexual desire the one human inclination that cannot satisfy basic moral requirements. Only in the 20th century did philosophers begin treating sex as potentially good in itself. This history reveals something important. Our assumptions about sex shape our moral conclusions about it. If you believe sexual desire inherently reduces persons to objects, you will conclude that rigid constraints are necessary. If you believe sexual desire naturally brings people together in mutual joy, you will reach different conclusions. Philosophy cannot merely describe these competing views. It must evaluate the reasoning behind each position. The goal is not to announce verdicts, but to expose the hidden premises that drive different conclusions. Sexual desire connects biology, psychology, culture, and ethics in ways few other phenomena can match. Evolution shaped our brains to seek sexual partners through mechanisms we barely understand consciously. Neuroscience reveals that desire, pleasure, and attachment involve distinct but interacting neural systems operating beneath awareness. Sociology shows that every culture regulates sexuality differently, yet all cultures regulate it intensely. These facts constrain philosophical theorizing. Any adequate account must respect what science has discovered. But science cannot answer the distinctly philosophical questions about meaning, value, and moral permissibility. What makes an act sexual rather than something else? Is sexual pleasure valuable in itself or only as a means to other goods? When does consent make sexual activity morally permissible? And when is consent insufficient? Do sexual desires reveal something essential about human nature, or are they social constructions? These questions have practical consequences for how we structure relationships, raise children, and write laws. Philosophy provides the tools to examine these questions with precision and intellectual honesty. Part 1. The nature of sexual desire. Before evaluating sexual behavior morally, we must understand what sexual desire actually is. This seems obvious until you try to define it precisely and discover surprising difficulties. Sexual desire is not simply desire for physical pleasure. A massage produces physical pleasure without being sexual. Sexual desire is not simply desire for reproduction. Most people having sex are not trying to conceive. Sexual desire is not simply desire involving genitals. Medical examinations involve genitals without being sexual. Each proposed definition fails because sexual desire is a complex psychological state with multiple dimensions. Philosophers identify three core concepts that must be distinguished: sexual desire, sexual activity, and sexual pleasure. Sexual desire is a psychological state that motivates behavior and involves a characteristic phenomenology, a felt quality. Sexual activity refers to behaviors that typically express or satisfy sexual desire, but can occur without it. Sexual pleasure is the subjective experience of satisfaction arising from sexual activity or fantasy. Which concept is most fundamental? If we define sexual desire as whatever motivates sexual activity, we move in a circle. If we define sexual activity as whatever satisfies sexual desire, we face the same circularity problem. One influential approach defines sexual desire by its distinctive intentional object, another person's body. Sexual desire aims at physical intimacy with another human being considered specifically as an embodied creature. This distinguishes sexual desire from desires for food, warmth, or intellectual companionship that have different objects. Kant articulated this view sharply. Sexual desire makes the person's body the focus, not their work or services. We can hire someone's labor or knowledge, but sexual desire wants the person themselves as a physical being. This observation grounds Kant's worry that sexual desire inherently threatens to reduce persons to mere means. A deeper question divides philosophers into two fundamental camps: pessimists and optimists about sexual desire. Pessimists believe sexual desire is inherently problematic because it conflicts with rationality and moral respect. They observe that intense sexual arousal diminishes clear thinking and focused attention on anything else. During arousal, the partner can become merely an instrument for achieving physical satisfaction and release. Sexual pleasure feels so powerful that it can override moral scruples and rational long-term planning. History provides endless examples of people ruining their lives for sexual gratification against their own interests. Augustine developed the pessimist position within Christian theology during the 4th and 5th centuries. Before the fall, he argued, Adam and Eve had rational control over their sexual organs and desires. After sin entered the world, sexual desire became uncontrollable, rising and falling without voluntary direction. This involuntary quality marks sexual desire as corrupted. It disobeys our will as we disobeyed God. Augustine allowed sex only for procreation because only reproduction provides a rational purpose that justifies the activity. Seeking sexual pleasure for its own sake surrenders rational control to animal appetite and invites spiritual danger. Kant secularized Augustine's pessimism by grounding it in pure moral philosophy rather than theological claims. His categorical imperative requires treating humanity in yourself and others always as an end, never merely as a means. Sexual desire, Kant argued, inherently treats the desired person as a means to physical satisfaction. He compared the discarding of a sexual partner after satisfaction to throwing away a squeezed lemon. Even consensual sex between strangers involves mutual objectification that violates the dignity of both persons. Kant concluded that only marriage could contain the dangers of sexual desire through lifelong reciprocal commitment. The philosophical concept of objectification deserves careful analysis because it grounds many pessimist arguments. Objectification means treating a person as an object, specifically treating them as lacking full human status. Martha Nussbaum identified 7 distinct ways someone might objectify another person in thought or action. Instrumentality means treating the person as a tool for your purposes rather than as an end in themselves. Denial of autonomy means treating the person as lacking self-determination or the capacity for independent choice. Inertness means treating the person as lacking agency, as something that can be acted upon without response. Fungibility means treating the person as interchangeable with other objects or persons of the same type. Violability means treating the person as lacking boundary integrity, as something that can be broken or penetrated. Ownership means treating the person as something that can be bought, sold, or possessed by another. Denial of subjectivity means treating the person as if their experiences and feelings do not matter. Pessimists argue that sexual desire naturally involves several of these objectifying attitudes toward the desired person. When sexually aroused, people focus on their partner's body parts and how those parts will produce pleasure. Partners become somewhat fungible. Desire often shifts between persons sharing similar attractive physical characteristics. The intense focus on physical satisfaction can crowd out attention to the partner's subjective experience. These observations suggest that sexual desire and moral respect for persons exist in fundamental tension. The pessimist concludes that special conditions are needed to make sexual activity morally permissible. Optimists reject the claim that sexual desire is inherently objectifying or morally dangerous by its nature. Bertrand Russell argued in the early 20th century that sex is generally good for human well-being. He observed that sexual repression causes psychological harm, while healthy sexuality contributes to happiness. The problem is not sexual desire itself, but social arrangements that make its expression harmful or guilty. Irving Singer defended sex as a natural dimension of embodied human existence that enhances our lives. Sexual desire brings people together in shared pleasure and intimacy that strengthen their emotional bonds. Contemporary optimists like Martha Nussbaum argue that objectification is not always morally problematic in every context. In the context of mutual respect and ongoing relationship, treating someone as a body can be appropriate. Lovers who trust each other may enjoy being treated as physical beings within a caring relationship. The context transforms what would otherwise be objectification into an expression of intimacy and acceptance. Nussbaum suggests that surrendering control and allowing yourself to be used can be wonderful with the right partner. What matters morally is not the physical act, but the relationship and attitudes within which it occurs. The debate between pessimists and optimists remains unresolved because they emphasize different aspects of sexual experience. Pessimists focus on the phenomenology of arousal, the narrowing of attention, the urgency, the diminished rationality. They note that these features appear in sexual desire regardless of context, relationship, or moral intention. Optimists focus on what sexual activity can achieve: intimacy, bonding, pleasure, and the affirmation of embodiment. They argue that desire's power does not make it inherently corrupting. Powerful goods require careful cultivation. Both camps must account for how sexual desire can produce both profound connection and terrible exploitation. Neuroscience illuminates this debate by revealing the brain mechanisms underlying sexual desire and related states. Sexual arousal activates the brain's reward system, particularly circuits involving the neurotransmitter dopamine. Dopamine creates feelings of motivation, anticipation, and pleasure that reinforce approach behaviors toward desired partners. The same system that makes food and achievement rewarding makes sexual activity intensely motivating and pleasurable. This neural architecture explains why sexual desire feels so urgent. It engages ancient survival and reproduction systems. The brain evolved to make sex rewarding because organisms that found sex rewarding reproduced more successfully. Different neurochemical systems govern desire, pleasure, and attachment as distinct but interacting psychological states. Oxytocin, sometimes called the bonding hormone, increases during physical intimacy and promotes feelings of closeness. It is released during touching, cuddling, and orgasm, strengthening emotional connections between partners over time. Vasopressin plays a similar role, particularly in male attachment and protective behavior toward bonded partners. These systems explain why sexual activity can create lasting emotional bonds even when partners intend casual encounters. The brain connects sexual pleasure with attachment through overlapping neural pathways that reinforce each other. Evolution shaped human sexuality over millions of years through mechanisms that philosophers must take seriously. Sexual selection theory explains why organisms develop traits that help them attract mates and reproduce successfully. Traits that increase mating success spread through populations even if they reduce survival in other ways. Human sexual psychology reflects ancestral environments where reproduction required different strategies for males and females. Males faced less biological cost per offspring and could increase reproductive success through multiple matings. Females faced higher biological costs and benefited from selecting mates who would provide resources and protection. These evolutionary pressures shaped brain mechanisms that produce sex differences in aspects of sexual psychology. On average, men report desiring more sexual partners and respond more strongly to visual sexual stimuli. Women, on average, emphasize emotional connection and long-term prospects when evaluating potential sexual partners. These averages mask enormous individual variation. Many individuals do not fit statistical patterns for their sex. Evolutionary explanations describe ultimate causes, not proximate mechanisms that could justify particular moral conclusions. Knowing why a desire evolved tells us nothing about whether acting on it would be morally permissible. The naturalistic fallacy warns against deriving moral conclusions directly from facts about natural processes or evolution. Just because evolution shaped us to desire something does not mean we should pursue or permit it. Evolution also shaped capacities for violence, deception, and exploitation that we rightly consider morally problematic. Natural does not mean good. Many natural phenomena cause suffering and violate our considered moral judgments. Philosophy evaluates sexual behavior using moral criteria that evolution cannot supply from biological facts alone. We must ask what makes sexual activity good or bad by standards independent of evolutionary origin. The nature of sexual desire thus includes biological, psychological, and potentially moral dimensions that interact complexly. Desire is a psychological state shaped by evolution that activates reward systems and motivates approach behavior. It focuses on embodied persons, in ways that can enhance intimacy or enable exploitation, depending on context. Neither pessimists nor optimists capture the full picture. Both identify genuine features of sexual experience. The question is not whether sexual desire is inherently good or bad, but what conditions make its expression valuable. Answering that question requires examining the moral frameworks philosophers have developed for evaluating sexual conduct. Part 2. Ancient Greek Philosophy of Eros. The Greek word eros names a force that ancient philosophers considered fundamental to human existence. Unlike our modern concept of sexual desire, eros encompassed longing, striving, and passionate pursuit of any valued object. The Greeks did not separate erotic attraction from the desire for wisdom, beauty, or immortality. Understanding eros required understanding the structure of human motivation and our relationship to the good. Plato's dialogue The Symposium remains the most influential philosophical treatment of eros in Western history. Written around 385 BCE, it presents multiple speeches praising the god Eros at a drinking party. The dramatic setting matters philosophically. Wine loosens tongues, and Eros loosens rational control over discourse. Each speaker reveals something about his own character and assumptions, while ostensibly discussing love. Phaedrus opens by praising Eros as the oldest god who inspires courage and noble deeds. Lovers behave better because they cannot bear to appear shameful before those they love. This already suggests that Eros involves more than physical desire. It connects to honor and virtue. The beloved's gaze transforms the lover's behavior by creating standards the lover wishes to meet. Pausanias distinguishes two types of Eros corresponding to two Aphrodites, common and heavenly. Common Eros pursues bodies indiscriminately, seeking physical pleasure without concern for the beloved soul. Heavenly Eros loves the soul more than the body, and seeks lasting connection with a worthy person. This distinction anticipates later philosophical debates about whether sexual desire is inherently objectifying or potentially ennobling. Pausanias defended the Athenian institution of pederasty, the socially regulated relationship between older men and adolescent boys. He argued that properly conducted, such relationships transmitted virtue from lover to beloved through intimate mentorship. The physician Eryximachus extends Eros to a cosmic principle governing harmony throughout nature and medicine. This suggests that sexual attraction participates in larger patterns of order that pervade the universe. Aristophanes, the comic playwright, offers the most memorable myth. Humans were originally double creatures split by Zeus. Each person wanders seeking their other half, and finding it produces the overwhelming sense of completion lovers describe. Sexual union attempts to heal this primordial wound by merging two beings back into one. The myth captures something true about the experience of love. The beloved feels uniquely necessary, irreplaceable. Agathon praises Eros as the youngest, most beautiful, and most virtuous of gods in elegant rhetorical flourishes. Socrates gently demolishes Agathon's speech by asking whether Eros desires beauty or already possesses it. If Eros desires beauty, then Eros itself must lack beauty. You cannot desire what you already have. This logical point transforms the entire discussion. Eros is not a god, but a spirit between mortal and divine. Socrates then reports teachings he received from Diotima, a priestess who instructed him about love's nature. Having a woman teach Socrates about Eros inverts the usual gender dynamics of Athenian philosophical education. Diotima explains that Eros is the child of resourcefulness and poverty, conceived when the gods celebrated Aphrodite's birth. This parentage means Eros is always lacking, yet always scheming to obtain what it desires. Eros is neither beautiful nor ugly, neither wise nor ignorant, but a lover of wisdom seeking what it lacks. Philosophers are lovers of wisdom precisely because they recognize their ignorance and strive to overcome it. The true object of Eros is not merely beauty, but possession of the good forever. We want what we love to be ours permanently, which connects Eros to our desire for immortality. Humans achieve immortality through procreation, creating new beings that continue after our individual deaths. But Diotima reveals a ladder of erotic ascent that moves from physical to intellectual to metaphysical objects. The lover begins by desiring one beautiful body, then recognizes that beauty exists in all beautiful bodies. This recognition loosens attachment to any particular body as the lover perceives beauty more universally. Next, the lover appreciates beauty in souls, which exceeds bodily beauty and produces virtuous offspring in wisdom. Then beauty in practices, laws and sciences attracts the ascending lover toward ever more abstract objects. The culmination is sudden vision of beauty itself, eternal, unchanging, pure, and the source of all particular beauties. This form of beauty is not located in any body, discourse, or science, but exists absolutely in itself. Contemplating it produces true virtue, rather than mere images of virtue based on particular beautiful things. The philosopher who reaches this height becomes beloved of the gods and achieves immortality through wisdom. Physical sexual desire appears as the lowest rung on a ladder leading to transcendent philosophical insight. Eros is transformed from animal appetite into the very engine driving the philosophical pursuit of truth. This transformative interpretation has generated centuries of debate about what Plato actually meant and valued. Does the ladder require abandoning lower loves or incorporating them into a richer appreciation of beauty? Diotima says the ascending lover will consider the beauty of bodies a small thing compared to higher beauty. This suggests at minimum that physical Eros loses its grip as philosophical Eros strengthens and ascends. Critics argue Plato devalues embodiment and particular relationships in favor of abstract contemplation disconnected from real life. Defenders respond that the ladder describes psychological development without necessarily condemning where one started. The dialogue does not end with Diotima's teaching, but with the drunken arrival of Alcibiades praising Socrates. Alcibiades, the brilliant and beautiful aristocrat, confesses his erotic obsession with the philosopher who rejected him. He tried to seduce Socrates sexually, but Socrates spent the night beside him without any physical response. This rejection devastated Alcibiades, who experienced Socrates as uniquely attractive, yet impossibly self-controlled. Alcibiades describes Socrates as ugly outside but containing divine beauty within, like a statue hiding golden images. His speech complicates the ascending ladder by showing that even those who glimpse philosophical beauty may fail to ascend. Alcibiades knew Socrates was right about virtue, but could not bring himself to live philosophically rather than politically. He remained attached to honour, power and pleasure, eventually betraying Athens in pursuit of worldly success. The dialogue thus acknowledges that recognizing the value of philosophical eros does not guarantee following it. Human beings remain vulnerable to lower attractions even when they have seen something higher and better. This tragic dimension complicates any simple reading of Plato as dismissing bodily desire for pure intellectualism. The symposium shows both the heights Eros can reach and the depths to which it can drag even gifted souls. Aristotle, Plato's greatest student, took a different approach to pleasure and desire in his ethical writings. He treated temperance, moderation in bodily pleasures, as a central virtue that rational beings must cultivate. The temperate person enjoys pleasures appropriately, neither too much nor too little, in the right circumstances. Unlike Plato, Aristotle did not rank pleasures hierarchically, as if intellectual pleasures were always better than physical ones. Each pleasure is good in its proper place. The problem is excess or deficiency, not the bodily origin itself. Sexual pleasure specifically requires temperance because its intensity can easily overcome rational self-governance. Aristotle analyzed desire as arising from the appetitive part of the soul, distinct from reason and spirit. Appetite seeks pleasure and avoids pain. Reason determines whether particular pleasures are worth pursuing in context. The virtuous person has trained their appetites to align with reason so that they enjoy appropriate pleasures. Someone who merely restrains bad desires while still feeling them strongly has not achieved full virtue. True temperance involves feeling the right desires toward the right objects in the right amounts. This psychological ideal influenced later virtue, ethics approaches to sexual morality, emphasizing character over rules. Neither Plato nor Aristotle developed systematic theories of sexual ethics comparable to later Christian and Kantian approaches. They embedded sexuality within broader accounts of human flourishing, virtue, and the nature of love. Their legacy includes several tensions that subsequent philosophy inherited and developed in different directions. Is sexual desire fundamentally animal, or can it participate in our highest human capacities for reason and virtue? Should we transcend bodily eros toward purely intellectual objects, or integrate it into embodied human excellence? These questions from ancient Athens continue to shape philosophical debates about sexuality today. Part 3. Stoic and Epicurean Sexuality. After Plato and Aristotle, the Hellenistic philosophical schools developed distinctive approaches to sexuality and emotion. The Stoics and Epicureans both sought tranquility but disagreed fundamentally about how desire should be managed. Their debates illuminate enduring tensions between accepting natural desires and disciplining potentially disruptive passions. Understanding their positions requires grasping their broader psychological and ethical frameworks first. The Stoics believed that virtue alone constitutes the good life, and external circumstances cannot affect genuine happiness. Health, wealth, reputation, and pleasure are merely preferred indifferents, not true goods worth pursuing passionately. Passions, like erotic desire, arise from false judgments that external things have value they actually lack. The sage eliminates passion by correcting these cognitive errors and achieving apatheia, freedom from disturbing emotions. This does not mean feeling nothing, but replacing irrational passions with rational emotions grounded in correct judgments. The Stoic ideal is not cold detachment, but serene engagement with life unclouded by anxious grasping. Sexual desire presented particular challenges for Stoic psychology and ethics because of its notorious intensity. Erotic passion notoriously overthrows rational judgment, making people do foolish and harmful things for its sake. The Stoics classified Eros among the passions to be eliminated rather than merely moderated like Aristotle advised. Falling in love involves judging the beloved essential to your happiness, which contradicts Stoic teaching about indifference. The lover becomes dependent on another person's presence, affection, and continued existence for their own peace. This dependence creates vulnerability to grief, jealousy, and desperation that the Stoic sage must overcome. Seneca, the Roman Stoic, wrote extensively about managing sexual impulses and the dangers of erotic attachment. He acknowledged that sexual desire is natural and its satisfaction not inherently wrong when pursued moderately. But passionate love transforms natural desire into obsessive fixation that distorts judgment and destroys tranquility. The wise person uses sexual activity for natural purposes like procreation without becoming enslaved to its pleasures. Seneca compared uncontrolled lust to other addictions that promise satisfaction but deliver only deeper craving. Each indulgence strengthens the habit, making restraint more difficult and the passion more demanding over time. Epictetus, the former slave-turned-Stoic teacher, emphasized that our judgments about things cause distress, not the things themselves. Sexual frustration arises from believing we need particular partners or experiences that we may not obtain. By recognizing that no external object is truly necessary for our good, we free ourselves from desperate longing. This does not require celibacy, but changes our relationship to sexual activity from needy grasping to calm acceptance. If opportunities for appropriate sex arise, we may enjoy them. If not, we remain undisturbed and complete. The sage neither pursues sexual pleasure anxiously nor avoids it fearfully, but remains indifferent to its presence or absence. Marcus Aurelius, the emperor-philosopher, recorded private meditations revealing his struggles to maintain Stoic detachment from bodily pleasures. He advised himself to see sexual intercourse as merely friction of membranes followed by convulsive expulsion of mucus. This deliberately unromantic description aimed to puncture the inflated significance passion attributes to sex. By stripping away poetic and emotional interpretations, the act appears trivial rather than worth sacrificing dignity for. This technique of cognitive reframing recurs throughout Stoic practice as a tool for diminishing disruptive passions. Critics argue it achieves tranquility by impoverishing experience, denying the genuine value that intimacy can provide. The Roman poet Lucretius, following Epicurean philosophy, offered a different critique of erotic passion in his poem On the Nature of Things. Epicurus taught that pleasure is the highest good, but the relevant pleasure is absence of pain, not positive sensation. The wise person seeks ataraxia, undisturbedness, by satisfying natural and necessary desires while limiting unnecessary ones. Natural desires like hunger can be satisfied. Unnatural desires like ambition for infinite wealth cannot be fully satisfied. Sexual desire occupies an interesting middle position, natural but easily inflamed into something unnatural and insatiable. The body needs sexual release, but the mind transforms this need into romantic obsession that can never find contentment. Lucretius described erotic love as a form of madness produced by images that inflame desire without providing satisfaction. Lovers grasp at their beloveds but cannot truly possess them. Bodies press together, but consciousness remains separate. The lover wants something more than physical union, but cannot articulate what that something is or how to obtain it. This frustrated longing produces the characteristic symptoms of love: obsession, jealousy, idealization, and inevitable disappointment. Lucretius advised satisfying sexual urges with available partners rather than fixating on unattainable or idealized objects. Promiscuity is healthier than romantic passion because it prevents obsession from taking root and growing destructive. Both Stoics and Epicureans thus diagnosed romantic love as a pathology arising from false beliefs about what we need. They differed about whether the solution was eliminating desire for pleasure or satisfying it without obsessive attachment. Both traditions influenced later philosophy and Christian asceticism, which inherited their suspicion of erotic passion. The idea that sexual desire threatens rational self-governance became a recurring theme in Western moral psychology. Augustine knew Stoic and Epicurean arguments and incorporated their concerns into his Christian analysis of concupiscence. The philosophical therapy of desire, pioneered in Hellenistic schools, shaped centuries of reflection on sexuality's dangers. These ancient approaches share an assumption that passionate sexual attachment is problematic regardless of its object or context. Modern philosophers have questioned whether this assumption reflects genuine wisdom or cultural prejudice against embodiment. Perhaps the Stoic and Epicurean hostility to Eros expresses male anxiety about vulnerability and loss of control. Intimate relationships do create dependence, but this dependence may be constitutive of valuable human connection, not a defect. The question is whether tranquility achieved by avoiding deep attachment represents human flourishing or its impoverishment. Different answers to this question continue to divide philosophers reflecting on sexuality and emotional life today. Part 4. Augustine and Christian Sexual Pessimism. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, transformed Western thinking about sexuality more than any other figure. His influence persisted for over 1,000 years and continues to shape assumptions many people hold without knowing their source. Augustine's analysis combined personal experience, Neoplatonic philosophy, and biblical interpretation into a powerful synthesis. Understanding his views requires knowing both his life story and the theological controversies that shaped his arguments. Before his conversion to Christianity, Augustine lived with a concubine for 15 years and had a son with her. He knew sexual passion intimately and later described himself as having been enslaved to lust during this period. His Confessions, famously recounts praying for chastity while secretly hoping God would not grant it yet. This psychological honesty about the divided will became central to his mature theology of sin and grace. Augustine eventually sent his concubine away to make a socially advantageous marriage, an act he later regretted. His conversion involved renouncing sexuality entirely, and he became a celibate priest and eventually Bishop of Hippo. Augustine drew on Neoplatonic philosophy, which ranked spiritual reality above material existence in a cosmic hierarchy. The soul is superior to the body. Reason should govern appetites. Attachment to material pleasures distracts from higher goods. This framework predisposed Augustine to view sexual desire as a lower impulse that properly ordered souls must control. But he rejected the Manichaean dualism he had earlier embraced, which considered matter intrinsically evil and sexuality shameful. Against the Manichaeans, Augustine insisted that creation is good because God made it. Matter is not evil by nature. The problem is not that we have bodies, but that sin has disordered our relationship to bodily pleasure. Augustine's theology of original sin became the framework for his sexual ethics and influenced Western Christianity profoundly. Adam and Eve's disobedience in Eden did not merely set a bad example, it corrupted human nature itself for all descendants. Before the fall, Augustine speculated, Adam controlled his body perfectly, including his sexual organs and their responses. Erections and desires occurred only when reason chose to initiate them for the purpose of procreation, never involuntarily. After sin, the sexual organs became disobedient to the will as punishment for humanity's disobedience to God. Sexual arousal now rises and falls independently of rational choice, a humiliating reminder of our fallen condition. This involuntary quality of sexual response troubled Augustine deeply as evidence that we do not fully govern ourselves. He called this condition concupiscence, a term referring especially but not exclusively to disordered sexual desire. Concupiscence is not itself sin, but it inclines us towards sin by overwhelming reason with urgent bodily demands. Even married couples engaging in procreative sex cannot entirely avoid the concupiscent pleasure that accompanies the act. Augustine allowed that procreative marital sex is not sinful because its purpose excuses the unavoidable pleasure involved. But seeking sexual pleasure for its own sake, even within marriage, constitutes at least venial sin against proper ordering. Augustine defended marriage against those who considered it evil, but his defense was notably unenthusiastic and limited. Marriage serves three goods: offspring, fidelity between spouses, and the sacramental bond that represents Christ and the Church. These goods justify the marital act, but they do not redeem sexual pleasure itself, which remains a consequence of sin. Virginity and celibacy are superior states because they avoid entanglement with concupiscence that marriage inevitably involves. Augustine ranked widowhood above marriage and consecrated virginity above both as the most perfect human condition. This hierarchy shaped Catholic teaching about religious life and priestly celibacy for centuries afterward. The theological controversy with Pelagius sharpened Augustine's views about original sin and its transmission through generation. Pelagius taught that humans can achieve moral perfection through their own efforts without special divine grace. Augustine countered that original sin so corrupted human nature that no one can do good without God's gracious assistance. He connected this doctrine to sexuality by arguing that concupiscence transmits original sin from parents to children. The shameful pleasure accompanying conception somehow taints the child produced, requiring baptism to remove the inherited guilt. This linkage of sex, sin, and transmission guaranteed that Christianity would view sexuality with deep suspicion. Augustine's account of prelapsarian sexuality reveals his assumptions about what undamaged human nature would have been like. Adam could have impregnated Eve through calm, deliberate action, like moving his arm, without passion-overwhelming reason. Sexual organs would have responded to rational command the way other body parts obey our intentions to move them. This counterfactual speculation shows Augustine's ideal: sexuality fully subordinated to rational and procreative purposes alone. The intensity of sexual pleasure that temporarily suspends rational thought appears as a symptom of fallen, disordered nature. What we experience as the height of intimacy, Augustine interpreted as evidence of our degradation from original perfection. Modern readers often find Augustine's views pathological, perhaps reflecting unresolved guilt about his own sexual history. His inability to imagine positive value in erotic pleasure beyond procreation strikes many as impoverished and distorted. Feminist scholars note that his framework makes women's bodies sites of temptation and transmission of sin. The association of sex with shame, guilt, and fallenness has caused immense psychological harm throughout Western history. Yet Augustine's analysis contains genuine insight into the phenomenology of desire and the experience of divided will. He articulated something real about how sexual desire can conflict with our considered values and long-term interests. Augustine's influence established the pessimistic tradition in Western philosophy of sex that later thinkers either extended or opposed. Medieval theologians systematized his insights. Reformation Protestants adapted them. Secular philosophers eventually challenged them. The assumption that sexual desire is inherently problematic and requires special justification became common Western wisdom. Even philosophers who rejected Augustine's theology often retained his suspicion that sexuality threatens rational autonomy. Kant's analysis of sexual objectification, though secular, echoes Augustinian concerns about dignity lost in carnal pleasure. Understanding Augustine is essential for understanding why Western philosophy has so often viewed sex with anxiety and distrust. Part 5. Aquinas and Natural Law. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th-century Dominican theologian, provided the most systematic philosophical framework for Christian sexual ethics. His natural law theory grounded moral rules in the rational structure of creation rather than arbitrary divine commands. This approach remains influential today, particularly in Catholic moral teaching and among contemporary natural law theorists. Understanding Aquinas requires grasping his Aristotelian methodology and his theological assumptions about creation's purposes. Aquinas distinguished 4 types of law: eternal law in God's mind, natural law accessible to human reason, divine law revealed in Scripture, and positive law made by human authorities. Natural law consists of moral principles that rational creatures can discover by reflecting on human nature and its purposes. The first principle of natural law states that good should be pursued and evil avoided. Subsidiary principles derive from examining the natural inclinations that God built into human beings as guides to proper action. Humans naturally incline toward preserving life, procreating and educating offspring, living in society, and knowing truth about God. Actions that fulfill these inclinations are naturally good. Actions that frustrate them are naturally evil, regardless of consequences. Sexual ethics in this framework depends on identifying the natural purpose, the telos, of sexual organs and activity. Aquinas followed Aristotle in believing that every natural capacity exists for some function that determines its proper use. The natural purpose of sexual organs is reproduction, continuing the species by producing offspring who need extended nurturing. Sexual acts are morally permissible only when they serve this reproductive purpose within appropriate institutional structures. Marriage provides the stable context necessary for raising children, so sexual activity properly occurs only between married spouses. Any sexual act that cannot lead to procreation is unnatural and therefore intrinsically evil, regardless of circumstances. This reasoning produced Aquinas' famous hierarchy of sexual sins ranked by their distance from reproductive purpose. Simple fornication between unmarried persons is sinful because it occurs outside marriage, but the act itself is procreative in form. Adultery is worse because it adds injustice to the wronged spouse and potential confusion about paternity. Rape is still worse because it involves violence and violates the victim's will along with the sexual disorder. But unnatural acts are the worst category because they frustrate the very purpose for which sexual capacity exists. Aquinas classified masturbation, sodomy, bestiality, and any non-procreative sexual acts as sins against nature itself. This hierarchy strikes many modern readers as bizarre. How can masturbation be worse than rape in any coherent moral framework? The answer lies in Aquinas' distinction between sins against particular persons and sins against cosmic rational order. Rape harms an individual terribly, but does not contradict the natural teleology of sexual organs considered in themselves. Masturbation harms no identifiable individual, but contradicts the very purpose for which God created sexual capacity. Sins against nature offend God as the author of nature more directly than sins that misuse natural capacities while preserving their form. This reasoning depends on teleological metaphysics that many contemporary philosophers reject as scientifically unfounded. Aquinas did not consider sexual pleasure evil in itself, unlike some interpretations of Augustine might suggest. God designed pleasure as an inducement to perform acts necessary for human survival and species continuation. Eating is pleasurable so that we will nourish ourselves. Sex is pleasurable so that we will reproduce despite the costs. The pleasure is good when it accompanies the naturally ordered act and motivates pursuit of genuine goods. What makes seeking pleasure for its own sake problematic is divorcing it from the purposes that justify the activity. Pursuing sexual pleasure outside procreative marriage treats the pleasure as an end rather than an inducement to proper ends. Contemporary natural law theorists like John Finnis have updated Aquinas' approach while attempting to avoid some difficulties. Finnis argues that sexuality properly expresses and actualizes the marital good, a two-in-one flesh union of spouses. This union is intrinsically valuable as a basic human good, not merely instrumentally valuable for producing children. Sexual acts are morally good when they instantiate this marital communion, and wrong when they use bodies merely for pleasure. Contraception is wrong because it intentionally blocks the procreative meaning that makes sexual union a marital act. Non-marital sex is wrong because the union it simulates lacks the comprehensive commitment that constitutes real marriage. Critics of natural law sexual ethics raise numerous objections at both theoretical and practical levels of analysis. The identification of natural purposes seems to commit the naturalistic fallacy, deriving values from facts about biology. Even if sexual organs have reproductive functions, it does not follow that every use must serve that function exclusively. Mouths evolved for eating and breathing, but speaking and kissing do not violate their natural purpose problematically. Why should sexual organs be subject to stricter teleological constraints than other body parts with multiple possible uses? The exclusion of homosexual relationships depends on the claim that only penile vaginal intercourse counts as natural sexual union. But this privileges reproductive biology over emotional, relational, and experiential dimensions of human sexuality. Two persons of the same sex can love each other, commit to each other, and experience profound intimacy through sexual expression. Natural law theorists respond that the physical complementarity required for procreation is essential to sexual integrity. This disagreement reflects deeper disputes about whether sexual ethics should be grounded in biology, relationships, or both. Natural law provides a comprehensive framework many find compelling, but its conclusions remain highly contested philosophically. Part 6. Kant's Sexual Philosophy. Immanuel Kant developed the most influential secular philosophical critique of sexual desire in the modern period. His analysis of sexuality in the Lectures on Ethics presents sexual inclination as uniquely problematic among human desires. Kant argued that sexual desire inherently conflicts with the moral requirement to treat persons as ends in themselves. This argument connects his sexual ethics to the broader framework of deontological moral philosophy grounded in rational autonomy. Kant distinguished between using people and treating them as ends by examining what makes human beings morally special. Humans possess dignity because they are rational agents capable of setting ends and governing themselves through moral principles. The categorical imperative commands us never to treat humanity, in ourselves or others, merely as a means to our ends. We may use people's services and labour with their consent, but we must simultaneously respect their autonomous rational agency. The question for sexual ethics is whether sexual desire permits this dual treatment or inherently reduces persons to objects. Kant's disturbing answer is that sexual desire, by its nature, treats persons as things, not as autonomous rational beings. Sexual desire differs from other desires because its object is the person's body itself, not their work or services. When I hire someone's labour, I want what they can do for me while leaving their personhood intact and respected. When I sexually desire someone, I want their body as a physical object for my sensory pleasure and gratification. The person becomes a means to my physical satisfaction in a way that differs from ordinary commercial or social transactions. Kant captured this point memorably by comparing the sexual partner to a lemon squeezed and discarded after use. Once desire is satisfied, the person who satisfied it loses their special interest. They were wanted as body, not soul. This objectification extends in both directions. Sexual desire makes me objectify myself as well as my partner. In offering myself sexually, I make my body available as an object for another's use and gratification. I allow myself to be treated as a thing, which Kant considered self-degradation, contrary to duties we owe ourselves. Sexual activity thus involves mutual objectification that violates the categorical imperative in its self-regarding and other-regarding forms. Neither consent nor reciprocity resolves the problem because both parties are consenting to impermissible treatment of persons as things. Two wrongs do not make a right. Mutual degradation remains degradation even when freely chosen by both parties. Kant's solution to this dilemma is marriage, understood as a legal contract with specific characteristics that neutralize objectification. In marriage, each spouse gives their entire person to the other through a permanent and exclusive commitment. What I give away, I simultaneously receive back. My spouse's person becomes mine as mine becomes theirs. This reciprocal total exchange means that in using my partner's body, I am also using what now belongs to me through the contract. The objectification is undone by the fact that I have given myself equally, creating a union rather than exploitation. Outside marriage, sexual activity cannot achieve this neutralizing reciprocity and therefore remains morally impermissible. This argument leads Kant to extremely restrictive conclusions about permissible sexual activity that few contemporaries accept. All non-marital sex is wrong because it involves objectification that marriage alone can neutralize through total reciprocal exchange. Casual sex, prostitution and affairs treat persons as mere instruments for pleasure without the compensating marital union. Even engaged couples should abstain because the legal bond that creates reciprocal ownership has not yet been established. Masturbation is wrong because it uses one's own body as an object for pleasure, violating duties to oneself. Homosexual acts are wrong because Kant assumed they could not form the complete reproductive union marriage requires. Contemporary philosophers have criticized Kant's argument at several crucial points, while preserving some of its insights. The claim that sexual desire necessarily objectifies seems psychologically inaccurate and reflects a narrow view of sexual experience. Lovers often focus intensely on their partner's pleasure, autonomy, and subjective experience, rather than treating them as mere bodies. Sexual desire can involve wanting to be with a particular person in their full complexity, not just wanting a body. The lemon metaphor may describe some sexual encounters, but fails to capture loving sexual intimacy between caring partners. Martha Nussbaum has argued that objectification admits of degrees and forms, some of which may be benign in appropriate contexts. Treating someone as an instrument for pleasure can occur within relationships that also affirm their autonomy and subjectivity. Context matters. Being treated as a body by an intimate partner who respects you overall differs from being reduced to a body permanently. Perhaps the problem is not objectification per se, but objectification that excludes recognition of the person's full humanity. Loving relationships can include moments of objectification that do not define the relationship or deny the other's personhood. The marriage solution also raises difficulties, both conceptual and practical, for Kant's overall framework. If objectification is intrinsically wrong because it violates human dignity, how can a legal contract make it permissible? The wrong seems to lie in the act of treating someone as an object, which marriage does not change phenomenologically. Perhaps marriage works by changing the meaning of the act through the total commitment each spouse has already made. But this suggests that context and commitment, not just legal status, can transform sexual activity from wrong to permissible. Such a move would open space for committed relationships outside legal marriage that Kant explicitly rejected allowing. Despite these criticisms, Kant's analysis identifies something important about the moral risks involved in sexual encounters. Sexual vulnerability is real. People can and do use others sexually in ways that cause serious psychological and moral harm. The intensity of sexual desire can override respect for others and ourselves, leading to behavior we later regret. Kant articulated worries about objectification and exploitation that feminist philosophers have developed in different directions. His emphasis on treating persons as ends provides a standard for evaluating sexual conduct that many still find compelling. The question is whether his conclusions follow necessarily from his premises or reflect unexamined cultural assumptions about sexuality. Part 7. Schopenhauer on Sex and Will. Arthur Schopenhauer, writing in the early 19th century, developed the most radical philosophical pessimism about sexual love. His metaphysics of the will provided a framework for understanding sexuality as nature's trick on conscious beings. Where Plato saw Eros as potentially leading to truth, Schopenhauer saw it as the deepest manifestation of blind, purposeless striving. His analysis anticipated evolutionary psychology by decades while reaching conclusions far darker than Darwin's theory implies. Schopenhauer's metaphysics posits the will as the fundamental reality underlying all phenomena, including human consciousness. The will is not rational intention, but blind, insatiable striving that manifests as forces in nature and desires in animals. Everything that exists is objectification of the will at various levels. Gravity, chemical attraction, biological drives, conscious goals. The will has no purpose outside itself. It strives merely to continue striving, creating more life that suffers and strives. Consciousness evolved as an instrument of the will, helping organisms survive and reproduce more effectively. But consciousness brings suffering because it allows us to anticipate pain, remember loss, and recognize the futility of our strivings. Sexual desire is the will to life in its most concentrated and powerful form, driving organisms to perpetuate existence. Schopenhauer wrote that reproduction is the ultimate purpose of every organism and its strongest instinct underlying all others. The species cares nothing for individual happiness. It uses individuals as vehicles for continuing the stream of life. Sexual pleasure is the bait that lures conscious beings into serving purposes that have nothing to do with their personal well-being. Once desire is satisfied, the individual realizes they have been used and discarded by impersonal natural forces. The post-coital tristesse, the sadness that often follows sex, reveals that our deepest satisfactions cannot satisfy us. Romantic love is an even more sophisticated trick that nature plays on human beings with their developed consciousness. Falling in love feels like the most profound personal experience, revealing the unique significance of one particular individual. Schopenhauer argued that this feeling is an illusion produced by unconscious calculation about producing optimal offspring. We are attracted to those whose characteristics would complement our own, creating children with balanced constitutions. A short person finds tall people attractive, a thin person finds fuller figures appealing, opposite temperaments attract. What feels like destiny is actually the genius of the species manipulating individuals to serve reproductive purposes. The intensity of romantic passion correlates with the importance the species places on a particular pairing for its purposes. When someone feels that they absolutely must have a particular person, the will to life has found an optimal match. This explains why romantic love can be so overwhelming that people sacrifice everything, including life itself, for its sake. The individual's interests and rational judgment are overridden by drives that serve the species, not the person feeling them. Schopenhauer found it remarkable that the most sublime human emotions reduced to calculations about semen quality and genetic complementarity. The highest poetry and the lowest biological functions are unified at the level of will manifesting through different masks. After lovers achieve their goal and produce offspring, Schopenhauer observed, they often find each other disappointing or even repugnant. The illusion that made the other seem perfect dissipates once nature's purpose has been accomplished through their union. This explains the frequency of marital disappointment. People were never really in love with each other, but with fantasies serving reproduction. The children who result inherit the will to life and begin their own cycles of striving, suffering, and disappointment. Each generation perpetuates the pattern without learning from previous generations' discoveries of its futility. Schopenhauer's solution to the misery caused by will and sexuality was denial of the will through ascetic withdrawal. By refusing to participate in reproduction, individuals can break the chain that perpetuates suffering across generations. Celibacy represents not mere religious discipline, but metaphysical rebellion against the tyranny of blind striving. The saint who renounces sexuality achieves what the species fears most, the individual refusing to serve its purposes. Schopenhauer praised Christianity and Buddhism for recognizing that salvation requires overcoming attachment to worldly existence. Both traditions, despite their differences, understood that desire is the source of suffering, and its cessation brings peace. This philosophy influenced Nietzsche, Freud, and Wagner, who each developed its insights in different directions while resisting its pessimism. Nietzsche affirmed the will while rejecting Schopenhauer's ascetic conclusion as weakness disguised as wisdom. Freud secularized the unconscious will as libido while seeking therapeutic management rather than metaphysical denial. Wagner composed operas exploring sexual passion as simultaneously the highest experience and the source of destruction. Schopenhauer articulated a genuinely disturbing vision that later thinkers could not ignore, even when they rejected his conclusions. His analysis of romantic love as illusion remains philosophically relevant even for those who reject his metaphysical framework. Modern evolutionary psychology partially confirms Schopenhauer's insight that romantic attraction serves reproductive purposes unconscious to the persons experiencing them. Studies show that mate preferences correlate with biological fitness indicators that we assess without conscious awareness. Ovulating women prefer masculine features. Men prefer hip-to-waist ratios associated with fertility. Both prefer symmetrical faces indicating health. These findings suggest that our deepest attractions are indeed shaped by forces operating beneath conscious recognition. Whether this confirms Schopenhauer's pessimism or merely describes how evolution equipped us for reproduction remains debatable. Knowing why we desire does not necessarily show that our desires are illusions rather than genuine responses to real goods. Part 8. Hegel and the Dialectics of Desire. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich. Hegel developed a philosophy in which desire plays a central role in the development of self-consciousness itself. Unlike Schopenhauer's blind will, Hegelian desire is structured by recognition and achieves satisfaction only through relationships with others. This framework transforms how we understand sexuality by connecting it to fundamental questions about identity and intersubjective existence. Hegel's influence on later philosophers from Marx to Sartre makes his analysis essential for understanding modern thought about desire. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel describes how self-consciousness emerges through a dialectical process involving desire and recognition. The most basic form of desire seeks to consume its object. Hunger destroys food to sustain the hungry organism. But self-consciousness requires something that consumptive desire cannot provide: confirmation of one's existence as a conscious subject. I can only know myself as a self by being recognized as such by another consciousness that I simultaneously recognize. This mutual recognition is what desire ultimately seeks, though it often misunderstands itself as seeking simpler satisfactions. Human desire is always desire for recognition, even when it appears to be desire for objects or physical pleasures. The famous master-slave dialectic illustrates what happens when recognition fails to achieve mutual equality between consciousnesses. Two self-consciousnesses meet, and each demands recognition from the other while refusing to grant it in return. This produces a life-and-death struggle in which each risks life to prove their independence from mere biological existence. The one who fears death submits and becomes the slave. The one who persists becomes the master. But the master's victory is hollow because recognition from an enslaved consciousness does not satisfy the need it was meant to fulfill. Being recognized by someone you do not recognize as an equal cannot confirm your status as the subject you wish to be. Sexual desire can be understood through this framework as a form of the struggle for recognition enacted through bodies. Lovers seek from each other recognition that confirms their value, desirability, and reality as conscious subjects. The beloved's desire for me demonstrates that I am the kind of being worthy of being desired by another free consciousness. Sexual intimacy involves mutual vulnerability, each exposing themselves to the other's gaze and judgment intimately. This vulnerability is why sexuality connects so deeply to self-esteem. Rejection by desired partners wounds the self profoundly. We seek not merely physical pleasure, but confirmation of our worth through another's freely given desire for us. Hegel treated marriage and family as ethical institutions that properly channel desire into forms that achieve genuine mutual recognition. In the Philosophy of Right, he described marriage as the immediate ethical relationship where two persons become one spiritual unity. This unity is achieved not through contract alone, but through love that transforms two separate individuals into a shared life. Sexual desire within marriage serves the ethical purpose of producing family, which educates children and reproduces society. The family is the first form of ethical life, preceding civil society and the state in Hegel's hierarchical system. Sexual desire thus plays a role in the rational structure of social and political life, not merely individual psychology. Hegel's analysis implies that purely physical sexual encounters fail to satisfy human desire's deepest dimension, recognition. Anonymous or casual sex may produce physical pleasure, but cannot provide the confirmation of self that desire ultimately seeks. This explains why sexual satisfaction so often fails to satisfy. What we wanted was not what we got from the encounter. The body was present, but the recognition that would make the experience meaningful for self-consciousness was absent. Committed relationships offer the possibility of sustained mutual recognition that casual encounters cannot achieve. This suggests that traditional sexual ethics may have rational foundations in the structure of desire itself, not merely convention. Alexandre Kojeev's influential lectures on Hegel emphasized desire for recognition as the driving force of human history. Human beings differ from animals precisely in desiring things that have no biological utility, like prestige and honor. We desire the desire of others. We want to be wanted, valued, recognized as the subjects we take ourselves to be. Sexual jealousy represents desire's confrontation with the possibility that another possesses what we need from our beloved. The rival threatens our recognition by capturing the attention and desire that confirmed our worth and reality. This analysis illuminates why sexual infidelity wounds so deeply beyond any calculation of material or biological loss. Judith Butler later drew on Hegelian themes in analyzing how desire constitutes gendered identity through iterative performances. If self-consciousness is achieved through recognition, then sexual and gender identity depend on how others perceive and respond to us. We become the kinds of subjects that social structures recognize. Identity is not prior to, but produced through interaction. This insight has radical implications for understanding sexuality as constituted rather than merely expressed through social practices. Hegel's philosophy thus connects to contemporary debates about whether sexual desire and identity are natural facts or social constructions. The answer may be that they are both, natural capacities that achieve determinate form only through social and historical processes. Part 9. Freud's Philosophical Revolution. Sigmund Freud transformed Western understanding of sexuality, even though his primary ambition was developing clinical treatment rather than philosophy. His theories about unconscious desire, infantile sexuality, and the central role of libido in human psychology became cultural common sense. Whether or not his specific claims have survived scientific scrutiny, the framework he introduced changed how we think about ourselves. Understanding Freud philosophically requires separating his genuine insights from his more speculative theoretical constructions. Freud's most revolutionary claim was that sexuality does not begin at puberty, but is present from infancy in polymorphous forms. Infants experience bodily pleasure through multiple erogenous zones: the mouth in nursing, the anus in defecation, the genitals in touching. This infantile sexuality is not directed toward reproduction or even toward external objects in the adult sense. The infant seeks pleasure from its own body and from contact with caregivers who satisfy its needs. Development proceeds through stages, oral, anal, and phallic, each organized around different sources of bodily pleasure. Normal adult sexuality results when these early pleasures become subordinated to genital sexuality directed at external love objects. The Oedipus complex is the crucial developmental crisis in which the child's sexual desire confronts social and familial reality. The male child desires his mother and perceives his father as a rival for her affection and attention. Fear of castration, symbolizing paternal punishment for forbidden desire, forces the child to repress these wishes. Successful resolution involves identifying with the father and internalizing prohibitions that become the superego, the moral conscience. This process establishes heterosexual object choice and gender identity while burying infantile desires in the unconscious. Failed resolution produces neuroses, perversions, or arrested development that persist into adulthood and require therapeutic intervention. Freud's theory of repression explains how unconscious desires continue to influence behavior and experience without conscious awareness. Repressed wishes do not disappear, but remain active, seeking expression through dreams, symptoms, slips of the tongue, and disguised satisfactions. The unconscious operates according to its own logic, the primary process, which ignores time, contradiction, and external reality. Dreams are wish fulfillments that express repressed desires in symbolic form that evades the censoring ego. Neurotic symptoms are compromised formations satisfying forbidden desires while simultaneously punishing the person for having them. Civilization itself rests on collective repression of sexual and aggressive drives that would destroy social cooperation if expressed directly. Civilization and its discontents develops the philosophical implications of Freud's psychology for ethics and social theory. Human beings are fundamentally driven by desires, especially sexual and aggressive, that society must restrain for communal life to exist. Civilization requires sublimation, redirecting libidinal energy from direct sexual expression towards socially valued activities like art and science. But this redirection always involves renunciation that creates chronic dissatisfaction. Civilization makes us unhappy by its very nature. The more advanced the civilization, the more it demands from instinctual life, and the greater the resulting neurotic misery. We cannot return to primitive satisfaction without losing civilization's benefits, but we cannot have civilization without suffering repression. Freud distinguished between Eros, the life drive seeking ever greater unions, and Thanatos, the death drive seeking return to inorganic stillness. Sexuality belongs to Eros, binding individuals together in families and societies through libidinal ties and emotional bonds. But the death drive works against these connections, manifesting as aggression, sadism, and the compulsion to repeat traumatic experiences. Human beings are battlegrounds where these fundamental forces contend, producing the ambivalence that characterizes all intimate relationships. Love and hate are never fully separated. The people we love most are also those toward whom we harbor unconscious hostility. This ambivalence explains the intensity of jealousy, the frequency of marital conflict, and the violence that pervades family life. Philosophers have engaged Freud's ideas in various ways, sometimes accepting his insights while rejecting his theoretical apparatus. The Freudian unconscious challenges Enlightenment faith in human rationality and self-transparency as foundations for moral agency. If we do not know our own motives and desires, how can we be held responsible for actions driven by unconscious forces? Sartre rejected the Freudian unconscious precisely because it seemed to undermine the freedom central to existentialist ethics. Ricoeur treated Freud as a master of suspicion whose interpretive method reveals hidden meanings beneath conscious intentions. Lacan reread Freud through structural linguistics, arguing that the unconscious is structured like a language with its own grammar. Feminist philosophers have criticized Freud's account of female sexuality as reflecting patriarchal assumptions rather than psychological truths. The claim that women envy penises and feel inferior because they lack them projects male perspectives onto female experience. Freud admitted that female sexuality remained a dark continent he could not fully illuminate despite his theoretical efforts. Contemporary psychoanalysis has revised many of Freud's specific claims while preserving his emphasis on unconscious motivation and early development. Whatever the fate of particular doctrines, Freud established that sexuality is central to human psychology and cannot be ignored philosophically. Any adequate philosophy of sex must engage his legacy, whether by accepting, modifying, or explicitly rejecting his claims. Part 10. Existentialist Sexuality. Jean-Paul Sartre developed the most elaborate existentialist analysis of sexuality in Being and Nothingness, published in 1943. His phenomenological description of sexual desire reveals it as a fundamental mode of relating to others that necessarily fails in its aims. For Sartre, sexuality is not merely biological, but expresses the basic structure of human consciousness encountering other consciousnesses. Understanding his analysis requires grasping his broader ontology of being for itself and being for others. Human consciousness, the for itself, differs from mere objects by being aware of itself and capable of negating what exists. Objects simply are what they are. Consciousness is what it is not, and is not what it is, perpetually transcending any fixed definition. This means humans are radically free, not determined by their nature, history, or circumstances to be any particular way. But this freedom is also a burden, because we must choose ourselves without guidance from nature or God telling us what to be. We flee this anguishing freedom into bad faith, pretending we are determined things rather than self-creating consciousnesses. Authenticity requires accepting responsibility for our freedom while recognizing we can never achieve the solid self-identity of objects. Our relationship to others introduces new complexities because others are consciousnesses who perceive and judge us from outside. When another person looks at me, I become an object in their world, reduced from transcendent freedom to fixed thing. Sartre's famous example is being caught looking through a keyhole. Suddenly I experience myself as seen, as a spy. The look of the other objectifies me, assigns me an identity, and steals my freedom by defining who I am from outside. I simultaneously need this recognition to ground my identity and resent it as a violation of my transcendence. Interpersonal relations thus involve perpetual conflict, as each consciousness struggles to objectify the other, while resisting objectification itself. Sexual desire is one way we attempt to possess another's freedom, and Sartre analyzes its structure in remarkable phenomenological detail. In desire, I want to possess not merely the other's body, but their consciousness as it inhabits and animates their flesh. I want the other to be an object for me, while remaining a freedom that chooses me, an impossible combination. Desire attempts to capture consciousness in body, to make freedom become flesh that I can possess and control. The caress is not merely touching skin, but an attempt to incarnate the other's consciousness, to make their freedom present as body. I want the other's consciousness to lose itself in bodily sensation while still being there as the consciousness that desires me back. But desire necessarily fails because what it wants is contradictory and impossible to achieve even for a moment. If the other becomes pure flesh, mere body without consciousness, they are no longer what I desired, a freedom wanting me. If they remain pure consciousness transcending their body, I cannot possess them through physical intimacy at all. Orgasm represents this failure dramatically. At the moment of climax, the attempt to capture consciousness in flesh collapses. Pleasure overwhelms both partners, and they fall back into their separate subjectivities, having achieved nothing lasting. The project of desire resumes because it can never succeed. We are condemned to perpetually fail at possessing others through sex. Sartre analysed sadism and masochism as alternative strategies for handling the fundamental conflict between consciousnesses in sexual relations. The sadist tries to possess the other's freedom by making them experience their body as flesh through pain and humiliation. Forcing the other to suffer makes their consciousness captive to bodily sensation that I control and inflict. But sadism also fails because the victim retains the freedom to interpret their suffering, to judge the torturer as monstrous. Their consciousness escapes even while their body is possessed. The freedom I wanted eludes me despite the physical control I exercise. The masochist takes the opposite approach, attempting to become pure object for the other's freedom to use as it wishes. By giving up my subjectivity entirely, I try to exist only as the object the other sees, possessed and defined completely. This might seem to achieve the solidity of identity that the for itself perpetually lacks and anxiously desires. But masochism also fails because I can never actually extinguish my consciousness. I remain aware of choosing to submit. My freedom persists even in the attempt to abandon it, and the other recognizes that what they possess is still a consciousness, choosing abjection. No strategy resolves the fundamental conflict. We are condemned to fail at achieving genuine union or possession through sexuality. Sartre's pessimistic conclusions parallel Schopenhauer's despite their radically different metaphysical frameworks and philosophical vocabularies. Both see sexual desire as necessarily frustrated, seeking something it cannot achieve by its very structure. But where Schopenhauer blamed the will operating through us, Sartre locates the problem in the structure of consciousness itself. We want impossible things, to possess freedom, to be both subject and object, to transcend conflict through bodily union. These desires are not contingent wishes we could simply abandon, but structural features of how consciousness relates to others. Sartre offered no solution or escape because he believed the human condition is fundamentally characterized by this insoluble conflict. Part 11. Beauvoir and Embodied Existence. Simone de Beauvoir applied existentialist philosophy to the situation of women in The Second Sex, published in 1949. Her analysis transformed feminist thought by examining how women's sexuality is constructed through patriarchal social structures. Unlike Sartre's abstract analysis of consciousness, Beauvoir attended to how embodiment shapes lived experience differently for women and men. The Second Sex remains essential reading for anyone seeking to understand the philosophy of sexuality and gender. Beauvoir's central thesis is that woman is constructed as the other in relation to man, who represents the universal human subject. Man defines humanity by reference to himself. Woman is defined as what man is not, as deviation from the male norm. This structural position shapes every aspect of women's experience, from childhood socialization to adult sexuality and motherhood. The famous claim that one is not born but becomes a woman means that femininity is achieved through social processes, not biology. Female biology provides the raw material that patriarchal culture works upon to produce the gendered subject called woman. Nothing in nature makes women passive, nurturing, or sexually submissive. These characteristics result from how girls are raised and treated. Beauvoir rejected biological determinism while acknowledging that female bodies differ from male bodies in phenomenologically significant ways. Menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and lactation are experiences that shape women's relationship to their bodies distinctively. These processes involve involuntary bodily changes that can make women feel alienated from their own flesh, as foreign and uncontrollable. Male bodies are not exempt from involuntary processes, but patriarchal culture interprets female bodily functions as defining women's essence. Women become identified with their reproductive capacity in ways that men are not identified with their biological functions. This identification restricts women to immanence, repetitive biological processes, while men claim transcendence through creative activity in the world. Sexual initiation for women under patriarchy often involves violence, pain, and loss of bodily autonomy that marks female sexuality as submission. Beauvoir described women's first sexual experience as frequently traumatic, producing shame and alienation from one's own desire. The girl learns to experience her body as object for male desire, rather than as subject of her own erotic experience. She is taught to present herself as desirable rather than to pursue her own desires actively and confidently. This objectification is internalized so that women police themselves, viewing their bodies through the imagined male gaze constantly. Female sexuality becomes performance for an audience rather than authentic expression of embodied desire and pleasure. Beauvoir analyzed marriage as an institution that exchanges women between men and traps wives in domestic immanence, serving husbands. The wife becomes property whose sexuality belongs to her husband legally, economically, and psychologically through the marriage contract. Domestic labor is repetitive, unrecognized, and isolating, preventing women from developing as autonomous subjects through meaningful projects. Beauvoir described housework as Sisyphean, constantly undone, requiring perpetual repetition that produces nothing lasting. Marriage also ties women's economic survival to satisfying husbands sexually and domestically, regardless of their own desires or fulfillment. Few married women under patriarchy achieve the authentic selfhood that existentialism requires for genuine human flourishing. Motherhood, often celebrated as women's highest calling, actually poses threats to female transcendence and autonomous selfhood in Beauvoir's analysis. Pregnancy involves being inhabited by another being, one's body serving purposes beyond one's own projects and intentions. The mother may experience the fetus as alien presence, appropriating her body for its own growth and development. After birth, the demands of childcare absorb women's time and energy, preventing pursuit of independent creative activity. Beauvoir did not reject motherhood, but insisted it should be chosen freely rather than imposed as woman's inevitable destiny. When freely chosen and supported by social structures enabling women's independence, motherhood can be compatible with transcendence. Liberation for women requires transforming social structures that construct femininity as other and trap women in immanence. Economic independence is essential because financial dependence on men perpetuates women's subordination regardless of legal equality. Women must have access to education, professions, and public life on equal terms, with men to develop as full subjects. Sexual liberation involves women claiming their own desire rather than existing as objects of male desire and fantasy. Beauvoir anticipated later feminist debates about sexuality, pornography, and whether heterosexuality can be reformed or must be rejected. Her emphasis on freedom, transcendence, and authentic selfhood shaped feminist philosophy for decades after the second sex appeared. Contemporary feminists have criticized Beauvoir for various limitations reflecting her social position and historical moment. Her analysis sometimes replicates heteronormative assumptions and insufficiently addresses race, class, and other forms of oppression. The emphasis on transcendence may devalue activities traditionally associated with women that have genuine worth and significance. Care work, nurturing relationships, and embodied maternal experience need not represent failure of transcendence, but alternative modes of flourishing. Despite these criticisms, the second sex remains foundational for feminist philosophy of sexuality and gender. Any contemporary treatment must engage Beauvoir's legacy even while moving beyond the limitations her context imposed. Part 12. Phenomenology of Sexual Experience. Phenomenology, the philosophical study of the structures of conscious experience, offers distinctive resources for understanding sexuality. Rather than explaining sex biologically or evaluating it morally, phenomenology describes what sexual experience is like from inside. Maurice Merleau-Ponty developed the most influential phenomenological account of embodiment and its implications for sexuality. His work reveals how sexual experience discloses fundamental features of human existence that abstract philosophy often overlooks. Merleau-Ponty rejected both dualism, which separates mind from body, and reductionism, which eliminates mind in favor of body. Human beings are not minds inhabiting bodies like pilots in ships, but embodied subjects whose consciousness is thoroughly corporeal. My body is not an object I possess, but the manner in which I exist in and engage with the world around me. I do not have a body. I am my body, and bodily existence shapes every aspect of my experience and understanding. This lived body, the body as experienced from within, differs fundamentally from the objective body studied by anatomy and physiology. Understanding sexuality requires attending to the lived body and its modes of engaging with others in intimate encounters. Sexual desire is not merely a physical sensation localized in particular organs, but a mode of being toward the world and others. When I desire someone, my entire bodily orientation shifts. They become the focus around which my perceptual field organizes itself. The desired person is not an object I observe detachedly, but a presence that solicits my approach and invites engagement. Desire transforms how things appear. The beloved's features become beautiful, their gestures significant, their voice compelling. This transformation is not added to neutral perception, but restructures perception from the ground up through erotic orientation. Sexuality is thus a way of existing, not merely something that happens to bodies that otherwise exist non-sexually. Sexual intimacy involves what Merleau-Ponty called intercorporeality, the mutual interweaving of two embodied subjects in shared experience. When bodies touch intimately, clear boundaries between self and other blur as sensation flows across the contact zone. I feel my hand touching your skin, but I also feel your skin being touched. The experience has a double character. This reversibility, central to Merleau-Ponty's later philosophy, appears dramatically in sexual contact, where touching and being touched interchange continuously. Neither person is purely active or purely passive. Both participate in a shared field of sensory experience that neither controls completely. Sexual union is not two monads interacting externally, but a genuine intertwining of embodied existences in common sensation. The concept of flesh in Merleau-Ponty's late work extends beyond individual bodies to the sensible world as a whole that sustains perception. My flesh and your flesh are both manifestations of the flesh of the world, the sensible element that makes perception possible. Sexual intimacy reveals this deeper kinship. My body and yours are not alien to each other, but variations of common embodied existence. The feeling of profound connection in sexual experience points toward this ontological continuity beneath individual separation. We touch because we are both touchable. We feel each other because we share the same sensible nature. Sex is not a scandal to be explained away, but a disclosure of our fundamental embeddedness in sensible being with others. This phenomenological approach challenges both reductive and moralistic views that fail to take sexual experience seriously on its own terms. Reducing sex to biology misses the intentional structure that makes it meaningful human experience rather than mere mechanical coupling. Moralizing about sex without understanding what it is like misses what is actually at stake in sexual choice and behavior. Phenomenology describes the significance that sexual experience carries for those who undergo it prior to external evaluation. Understanding this significance is necessary for any ethics of sexuality that addresses human beings as they actually live and feel. Later, phenomenologists extended these insights in various directions, including feminist phenomenology of gendered embodiment and disability studies. Iris Marion Young analyzed how women learn to inhibit their bodily movement and capacity under patriarchal conditions of objectification. The girl learns to throw like a girl, not because of anatomy, but because she has been taught to experience her body as thing rather than capacity. This inhibited intentionality shapes sexual experience as well, producing the passive receptivity Beauvoir described as constructed femininity. Phenomenology thus connects with feminist analysis by showing how bodily experience itself is shaped by social structures and meanings. The body we inhabit is always already acculturated, trained, and positioned within relations of power that affect sexual possibility. The phenomenological tradition offers resources for understanding sexual experience that neither rationalist nor empiricist philosophies provide adequately. By taking the first-person perspective seriously, phenomenology captures what matters about sex for the people engaging in it. This does not replace biological, psychological, or ethical analysis, but provides a necessary foundation that these other approaches presuppose. Any adequate philosophy of sexuality must include phenomenological description alongside explanation, evaluation, and prescription. Understanding what sexual experience is, from inside, enables better understanding of why it matters so much to human beings. This understanding grounds more humane and realistic engagement with the ethical and political questions that sexuality raises. Part 13. Foucault and the Construction of Sexuality. Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, beginning in 1976, fundamentally challenged how philosophers and scholars understand sexuality and its history. His central claim is that sexuality as we know it is not a natural biological phenomenon, but a historical construction produced through discourse. This constructionist thesis has profound implications for ethics, politics, and the very possibility of sexual liberation. Understanding Foucault requires grasping his analysis of power, knowledge, and the subject formation they jointly accomplish. Foucault's target was what he called the repressive hypothesis, the widely held belief about modern sexual history that many take for granted. According to this hypothesis, the Victorian era and bourgeois capitalism repressed sexuality, which the 20th century gradually liberated. Sexual discourse was silenced, desire was prohibited, and pleasure was confined to procreative marriage enforced by law and custom. The sexual revolution of the 1960s finally broke these chains, allowing authentic sexuality to emerge and express itself freely. Talking about sex became itself a liberatory act, defying the repression that had kept sexuality shamefully hidden for centuries. Foucault argued that this entire narrative misunderstands what actually happened and how power actually operates on sexuality. Rather than being silenced, sexuality was actually the subject of an explosion of discourse from the 17th century onward. More people talked about sex in more contexts, producing more knowledge about it than ever before in Western history. The confession, developed in Catholic Christianity, was extended from religious to medical, psychiatric, and legal contexts of interrogation. People were incited to speak about their desires, fantasies, pleasures, and practices in ever greater detail to various authorities. This proliferation of sexual discourse did not liberate sexuality, but produced it as an object of knowledge and target of power. The very category of sexuality, as something individuals have and that defines who they are, emerged through these discursive practices. Foucault distinguished two regimes of sexual truth: ars erotica, found in ancient and Eastern cultures, and scientia sexualis, developed in the modern West. In ars erotica, truth about sex is derived from pleasure itself, transmitted secretly from master to initiate as esoteric knowledge. The goal is intensifying pleasure and cultivating erotic expertise rather than producing objective knowledge about sex as a natural phenomenon. In scientia sexualis, truth about sex is extracted through confession and analysed through scientific categories and medical discourse. Sex becomes something to be known rather than enjoyed, a deep truth about the self that expert interpreters must decipher. We are told that our sexuality reveals our deepest identity, and that only by understanding it scientifically can we know ourselves truly. The 19th century witnessed the production of sexual species: the homosexual, the masturbating child, the hysterical woman, the perverse adult. Before this period, same-sex acts were sins anyone might commit. Afterward, homosexuals became a distinct type of person with characteristic psychology. The homosexual now had a past, a childhood, an anatomy, and a way of life, all derived from their sexuality as central defining feature. This transformation from acts to identities created new objects of knowledge, new populations to manage, and new forms of selfhood. Medical and psychiatric authorities replaced religious authorities in defining sexual normalcy and deviance through ostensibly scientific categories. But this was not liberation from morality. It was the installation of new forms of power, operating through knowledge rather than mere prohibition. Foucault analysed power not as something possessed by sovereign authorities and wielded repressively against subjects from above. Power is rather distributed throughout society, operating through countless local practices that produce subjects rather than merely constrain them. Biopower describes the modern form of power that manages populations and individual bodies to maximize their productivity and utility. Sexuality became central to biopower because it connects individual bodies to population dynamics through reproduction and family structures. Controlling sexuality means controlling the future of populations. Hence the obsessive concern with masturbation, birth rates, and sexual hygiene. The state and its allied institutions invested enormous energy in understanding and managing sexuality for biopolitical purposes. The implication for sexual liberation is disturbing. Speaking freely about sex may not escape power, but extend its reach further into subjectivity. Every confession produces more knowledge that authorities use to classify, evaluate and manage sexual subjects more effectively. The therapist listening to your sexual history is not liberating you, but extracting information that reinforces sexual categories and norms. Gay liberation that affirms homosexual identity may inadvertently reinforce the very category that pathologized same-sex desire in the first place. Foucault suggested that resistance requires refusing the deployment of sexuality rather than claiming authentic sexuality against repression. Bodies and pleasures might provide escape from the grid of sexuality that has captured desire and identity in modern Western societies. Critics have questioned whether Foucault's analysis leaves any basis for distinguishing better from worse sexual arrangements or practices. If all sexual categories are constructions serving power, how can we criticize sexual violence, exploitation, or oppression? Foucault denied that his work implied relativism, but never fully articulated positive ethical or political standards for evaluating sexuality. His later work on ancient Greek and Roman sexual ethics explored alternatives to modern sexuality without straightforwardly endorsing them. The challenge Foucault poses is to think about sexuality without assuming that liberation simply means removing repression from natural desire. Whether his constructionism supports or undermines progressive sexual politics remains debated among philosophers and activists today. Part 14. Radical Feminist Analysis. Radical feminism developed a distinctive analysis of sexuality, arguing that male dominance is sexual and sexuality is male-dominated. Catherine MacKinnon and Andrea Dworkin articulated the most influential versions of this position in the 1970s and 1980s. Their work challenged both traditional sexual morality and liberal sexual liberation as inadequate responses to women's oppression. Understanding radical feminism requires taking seriously its claims about power, even when those claims seem extreme or uncomfortable. MacKinnon's central thesis is that sexuality is the primary site where gender hierarchy is created, maintained, and enforced. Gender is not merely difference between men and women, but a system of domination that constructs male supremacy and female subordination. Sexuality eroticizes this hierarchy. Men learn to find domination arousing, and women learn to find submission erotic. What we call sexual desire is not natural attraction, but socially constructed eroticization of inequality between the sexes. Heterosexuality under patriarchy is not mutual pleasure between equals, but institutionalized male control over female bodies. Even apparently consensual sex reflects and reinforces the broader system of male power over women in all spheres of life. This analysis implies that sexuality as currently constituted cannot be reformed through better communication or more consent. The problem is not individual bad actors, but a system that makes domination and submission seem natural and pleasurable. Women's desires are themselves shaped by patriarchy. What women want sexually has been constructed to serve male interests. A woman who enjoys submission is not expressing authentic desire, but enacting programming installed by male-dominated culture. This claim is controversial because it seems to deny women agency and authentic sexuality independent of patriarchal construction. MacKinnon responds that recognizing construction is necessary for eventually achieving genuine freedom, rather than mistaking bondage for choice. Andrea Dworkin extended this analysis in her book Intercourse, arguing that heterosexual penetration is inherently violating and possessive. The physical act of penetration enacts male invasion of female bodily integrity, occupying space inside women's bodies. This occupation represents symbolically and materially the broader male appropriation of women's lives, labour and selfhood. Dworkin did not claim all intercourse is rape, but she argued the distinction between rape and normal sex is less clear than commonly assumed. When women are economically dependent, socially pressured and culturally trained to serve men sexually, consent becomes problematic. The conditions for genuine consent, namely equality and freedom from coercion, do not exist under patriarchy as currently structured. Pornography became a central focus for radical feminist activism and analysis in the 1980s culture wars over sexual representation. McKinnon and Dworkin drafted model legislation defining pornography as a civil rights violation against women as a class. Their definition focused not on sexual explicitness, but on the subordination of women through sexually explicit material. Pornography depicts women as objects who enjoy degradation, pain, and humiliation, presenting this as what women truly want. Consuming pornography teaches men to see women as existing for male sexual use rather than as autonomous human beings. Production of pornography often involves actual coercion and harm to the women performers whose abuse is recorded and distributed. The ordinance proposed allowing women harmed by pornography to sue producers and distributors for civil damages rather than criminal prosecution. This approach framed pornography as discrimination rather than obscenity, shifting the legal analysis from morality to equality. Traditional obscenity law asks whether material offends community standards of decency and lacks serious artistic value. McKinnon argued this framework protects male sexual entertainment while failing to address harm to actual women. The equality approach asks whether material subordinates women and contributes to their second-class citizenship in society. This framing connected pornography to employment discrimination, sexual harassment, and other civil rights violations women face. The ordinance passed in Indianapolis but was struck down by federal courts as violating First Amendment protections for speech. The court acknowledged pornography might cause harm, but held that content-based restrictions on speech are unconstitutional viewpoint discrimination. Banning speech because it expresses unacceptable ideas about gender relations treats those ideas as dangerous precisely because they might persuade. This is exactly what the First Amendment prohibits: government determining which ideas citizens may encounter and consider. McKinnon responded that pornography is not speech, but conduct, specifically the subordination of women through sexual objectification. The debate exposed deep tensions between feminist equality claims and liberal free speech principles that remain unresolved. Critics from within feminism challenged radical feminist analysis on multiple grounds while sharing concerns about women's oppression. The claim that heterosexual desire is entirely constructed by patriarchy seems to deny any biological basis for sexual attraction. Many women experience their heterosexual desires as authentic rather than as programming imposed against their genuine interests. Telling women their pleasures are false consciousness replicates the paternalistic dismissal of women's voices that feminism opposes. The focus on sexuality may overstate its importance relative to economic, legal, and political dimensions of women's subordination. Radical feminism also inadequately addresses lesbian sexuality, which cannot fit easily into the heterosexual dominance framework. The legacy of radical feminist analysis remains contested but undeniably influential on subsequent philosophical and political debates. It established that sexuality is political, not merely personal, and that power relations pervade intimate life. The analysis of how culture shapes desire to serve dominant interests applies beyond gender to race, class, and other hierarchies. Whether radical feminism correctly diagnoses the problem and proposes adequate solutions continues generating philosophical controversy. Any serious philosophy of sexuality must engage these arguments rather than dismissing them as extremist or outdated. The questions radical feminism raised about consent, construction, and domination remain central to contemporary sexual ethics. Part 15. Liberal and sex-positive feminism. Liberal feminism and sex-positive feminism developed partly in response to radical feminist claims about sexuality and pornography. These perspectives share feminist commitments to women's equality, while emphasizing autonomy, choice, and sexual pleasure as feminist values. The debates between these feminist camps, sometimes called the feminist sex wars, revealed deep disagreements about liberation's meaning. Understanding these positions requires appreciating both their critiques of radical feminism and their positive visions for sexual politics. Liberal feminism grounds its analysis in individual rights, autonomy, and equal treatment under law, rather than structural power analysis. Women should have the same freedoms as men to make sexual choices without paternalistic interference from state or society. If men can consume pornography, visit sex workers, and engage in casual sex without legal penalty, women should have equal freedom. Restricting women's sexual choices to protect them from exploitation replicates the patriarchal logic that women need male protection. True liberation means women deciding for themselves what sexuality means to them without others defining their best interests. This includes choices that radical feminists consider harmful or degrading, provided they are made freely by competent adults. Martha Nussbaum developed a sophisticated liberal feminist response to McKinnon's claims about objectification and pornography. She distinguished 7 forms of objectification and argued that not all of them are morally problematic in all contexts. Treating someone as a body, as fungible, or as an instrument can be benign or even valuable within relationships characterized by mutual respect. Lovers may enjoy treating each other as beautiful objects of desire without this constituting degradation or denial of humanity. Context matters enormously. Objectification within loving relationships differs morally from objectification that denies personhood entirely. The radical feminist analysis conflates harmful objectification with forms that may be harmless or positively valuable for the participants. Nussbaum also defended some pornography and sex work against feminist condemnation while acknowledging serious concerns about exploitation. She compared sex work to other forms of bodily labor like factory work, domestic service, and professional athletics. All these occupations involve using one's body for pay, accepting direction from others, and performing tasks that may be unpleasant. Why should selling sexual services be uniquely degrading when selling other bodily capacities is considered legitimate labor? The stigma attached to sex work reflects irrational disgust about sexuality rather than reasoned analysis of actual harms involved. Under appropriate regulation ensuring safety and consent, sex work could be a legitimate occupation like any other bodily labor. Sex-positive feminism emerged from the lesbian and queer communities in the 1980s, emphasizing pleasure, desire, and sexual diversity. Radical feminism was criticized for being anti-sex, aligning unexpectedly with conservative moralists who also wanted to restrict sexual expression. Sex-positive feminists argued that sexuality can be a source of power, pleasure, and liberation for women rather than only victimization. Women's sexual agency includes exploring desires that may involve dominance, submission, role-playing, and other practices deemed politically incorrect. Feminist politics should expand women's sexual possibilities rather than contracting them according to ideological standards of acceptable desire. Policing women's sexuality in the name of feminism replicates patriarchal control rather than challenging it. Gail Rubin's influential essay, Thinking Sex, distinguished feminist analysis of gender from analysis of sexuality as related but distinct systems. Not all sexual oppression reduces to gender oppression. Sexual minorities of all genders face stigma and persecution. A progressive sexual politics must defend sexual diversity, including practices, identities, and communities that feminism has sometimes condemned. Rubin criticized the hierarchical valuation of sex that places married, heterosexual procreative sex at the top and other forms below. This sexual hierarchy harms women, but also harms queers, sex workers, practitioners of kink, and others whose sexuality deviates from norms. Coalition politics requires recognizing that different groups face distinct forms of sexual oppression, requiring distinct responses. The feminist sex wars revealed genuine disagreements that cannot be easily resolved by declaring one side correct and the other mistaken. Radical feminists identified real patterns of harm, exploitation, and inequality that pervade sexuality under patriarchal conditions. Liberal and sex-positive feminists identified real values of autonomy, pleasure, and diversity that restrictive approaches threaten to sacrifice. Perhaps sexuality under patriarchy is simultaneously a site of oppression and a source of potential liberation, depending on context and circumstance. Women are both constructed by power and capable of agency within and against the structures that constrain them. Navigating this complexity requires analysis, attentive to both structure and agency, rather than reducing everything to one or the other. Contemporary feminist philosophy continues debating these issues with new complications introduced by digital technology and changing sexual cultures. Online pornography is ubiquitous and freely accessible in ways the 1980s debates could not anticipate. Sex work has diversified to include cam performers, content creators, and other forms mediated by internet platforms. Consent culture and affirmative consent standards have become mainstream in some contexts while remaining contested in others. Trans inclusion has challenged earlier feminist frameworks that assumed stable categories of men and women defined by biology. The philosophical debates about sexuality and feminism continue evolving as the social conditions they address change rapidly. Part 16. Consent Theory in Depth. Consent occupies a central place in contemporary sexual ethics, often treated as the primary criterion distinguishing permissible from impermissible sex. The liberal principle seems clear. Sexual activity between consenting adults is permissible. Sex without consent is wrong and often criminal. But philosophical analysis reveals that consent is far more complicated than this simple principle suggests. Understanding what consent is, how it is communicated, and what conditions validate it requires careful conceptual work. Philosophers distinguish between performative and attitudinal consent as different ways of understanding what consenting involves. Performative consent is an external act, saying yes, signing an agreement, or engaging in behavior that signals willingness. Attitudinal consent is an internal mental state, actually wanting the activity to occur and being psychologically willing to participate. These can come apart in troubling ways. Someone may say yes while internally unwilling, or participate willingly without explicit verbal consent. Sexual ethics requires determining which type of consent matters morally and how to verify that it is present. Different answers generate different practical implications for what counts as consensual sexual activity. The conditions for valid consent raise further philosophical questions about when apparent consent should be considered genuine. Consent given under coercion is invalid because the threat of harm vitiates voluntary choice. Physical force obviously coerces, but what about economic pressure, emotional manipulation, or implicit threats of relationship consequences? A woman who has sex with her boss, fearing job loss if she refuses, has not consented freely, even if she says yes. The difficulty is determining where legitimate persuasion ends and illegitimate pressure begins across the spectrum of influence. Some pressure is inevitable in human interaction. The question is which forms undermine the voluntariness consent requires. Deception also problematizes consent, because one cannot genuinely agree to what one does not understand or has been misled about. If someone lies about being married, having a disease, or using contraception, has their partner consented to the actual encounter? The partner consented to sex with the person as represented, not the person as they actually are. But this principle, pushed too far, would invalidate most consent, since no one fully discloses everything about themselves before sex. Drawing the line between deception that invalidates consent and non-disclosure that does not require principled criteria hard to specify. Presumably, deception about matters material to the choice to have sex differs from concealing irrelevant personal information. Intoxication raises particularly difficult questions about capacity to consent that have practical implications for sexual assault law. Someone unconscious from alcohol clearly cannot consent. But what about someone who is drunk but still conscious and communicating? Alcohol lowers inhibitions, impairs judgment, and reduces the ability to assess risks and consequences of choices. The same acts that appear consensual while intoxicated may be experienced as violations when sobriety returns. But if any intoxication invalidates consent, then enormous amounts of sexual activity between drinking adults becomes assault. The law and ethics struggle to draw lines about degrees of intoxication that preserve both autonomy and protection from exploitation. Affirmative consent standards require positive indication of willingness rather than merely the absence of expressed refusal. Traditional standards allowed proceeding unless the other person said no or physically resisted, placing the burden on the unwilling party. Affirmative consent shifts the burden to the initiating party, who must obtain clear signals that their advances are welcome. This standard better protects those who freeze, fear retaliation for refusing, or are socialized not to assert their boundaries. Critics argue that affirmative consent is unrealistic, criminalizing normal sexual negotiation that does not proceed through explicit verbal permissions. Defenders respond that clear communication should be normative, even if it differs from how many people currently approach sexual encounters. The question whether consent is sufficient for permissibility or merely necessary divides philosophers of sexual ethics sharply. Liberals typically hold that consent is both necessary and sufficient. Anything consenting adults choose to do together is morally permissible. Others argue that consent is necessary but not sufficient because some activities remain wrong even when freely chosen. Kant held this view. Consenting to be used merely as a means still wrongs oneself and does not legitimate the other's action. Some feminists argue that consent under conditions of inequality cannot be fully valid even when outwardly free. The question connects to deeper issues about autonomy, harm, and whether some choices are self-undermining or degrading, regardless of consent. Alan Wertheimer's comprehensive philosophical analysis of consent examined these and many other complications with rigor and nuance. He concluded that consent is morally transformative, making permissible what would otherwise be wrong under appropriate conditions. Those conditions include competence to choose, adequate information, absence of coercion, and other requirements that admit of degrees. No bright line separates valid from invalid consent. Instead, we face a spectrum requiring judgment in particular cases. Sexual ethics cannot rely on consent as a simple criterion, but must engage the complex normative questions consent involves. This does not mean abandoning consent as central, but rather understanding it as a philosophically loaded concept requiring ongoing analysis. Part 17. Philosophy of Sexual Perversion. The concept of sexual perversion raises philosophical questions about whether some sexual desires or acts are abnormal, deviant, or wrong. Historically, many forms of sexuality now considered normal were classified as perversions, requiring medical treatment or criminal punishment. Philosophical analysis asks what perversion means, whether the concept is coherent, and what normative implications it carries. Thomas Nagel's influential 1969 essay, Sexual Perversion, provides the most important philosophical framework for these questions. Nagel distinguished three possible approaches to defining sexual perversion: statistical, moral, and psychological accounts. Statistical definitions classify as perverse whatever deviates from the frequency with which most people behave sexually. This fails because unusual is not the same as perverse. Celibacy is unusual, but not typically called a perversion. Moral definitions classify as perverse whatever sexual acts are morally wrong, but this seems to conflate distinct evaluative concepts. Rape is morally wrong, but not called perverted. Foot fetishism may be called perverted without clear moral wrongness. Perversion seems to be a psychological rather than moral category, concerning the structure of desire rather than the ethics of action. Hegel proposed a psychological definition based on the structure of sexual desire and its characteristic forms of completion. Human sexual desire, unlike simple appetite, involves complex psychological interactions between persons aware of each other's awareness. When I desire you, I want you to desire me. When you desire me, you want me to desire you. This creates a structure of mutual awareness. I am aware that you are aware that I desire you, and this awareness affects my desire. Completed sexuality involves each partner sensing the other, sensing them in a mutual embodiment of desire and response. This reciprocal incarnation, each becoming aware of their own body through the other's awareness of it, characterizes paradigmatic sexual experience. Perversion, on this account, is sexuality that deviates from this paradigm structure of mutual awareness and reciprocal incarnation. Fetishism is perverted because it focuses on objects like shoes that cannot participate in the complex psychological interaction. Voyeurism is perverted because the voyeur desires without participating in mutual awareness. The observed does not know they are desired. Exhibitionism involves wanting to be seen, but not engaging in reciprocal desire for the viewer as a desiring subject. Paedophilia is perverted because children cannot participate in the adult psychological complexity that sexual interaction requires. These perversions truncate or distort the psychological structure that characterizes fully realized human sexuality. Hegel was careful to distinguish his psychological account from moral evaluation of perverted desires and acts. Calling something perverted does not automatically make it immoral. Incompleteness is not the same as wrongness. A preference for perverted sexuality might be like a preference for fast food, suboptimal but not morally significant. Whether perversion carries moral weight depends on further arguments about harm, consent, or other normative considerations. Hegel suggested that perverted sexuality is missing something valuable that complete sexuality provides, but this lack may be tolerable. The concept describes a psychological kind without settling what attitudes we should take toward instances of that kind. Critics have challenged Hegel's account on various grounds, while often preserving his approach of seeking structural rather than moral definitions. The privileging of mutual awareness may reflect heterosexual and romantic assumptions about what good sex involves. Some people prefer objectification, asymmetry, or detachment. Why should mutual incarnation be the standard of completion? The account seems to pathologize preferences that may be harmless variations rather than deficient forms of sexuality. Why is shoe fetishism truncated sexuality rather than simply different sexuality with its own internal logic and satisfactions? Social constructionists argue that the entire category of perversion reflects cultural norms rather than psychological or natural facts. What counts as perverted varies historically and across cultures. Behaviors perverted in one context are normal in another. The classification of homosexuality as perversion until recently shows how the category serves social control rather than neutral description. Removing homosexuality from psychiatric manuals did not result from discovering it was not really perverted, but from changing social attitudes. This suggests perversion is a social kind whose boundaries depend on what behaviors the classifying society wishes to stigmatize. Philosophical analysis should unmask the power relations embedded in classification rather than refining criteria for allegedly objective categories. Contemporary philosophy has largely moved away from perversion as a useful concept for thinking about sexuality philosophically. The term carries too much historical baggage and too easily becomes a weapon against sexual minorities and nonconformists. This does not mean all sexual preferences are equally valuable or that anything consenting adults do is beyond criticism. But whatever critical vocabulary we develop should avoid implying that statistical minorities are defective versions of normal humanity. The philosophical work Perversion was supposed to do, distinguishing better from worse forms of sexuality, requires different conceptual tools. Attention to harm, consent, mutuality and flourishing may provide what we need without pathologizing categories of persons. Part 18. Sexual Orientation and Identity. Sexual orientation refers to enduring patterns of sexual attraction toward persons of particular genders or none at all. The categories heterosexual, homosexual and bisexual emerged historically and are now supplemented by additional identity terms. Philosophical debates concern whether these categories name natural kinds, social constructions, or something in between. The stakes are significant because different ontologies support different ethical and political positions regarding sexual minorities. Essentialism holds that sexual orientation is a deep, fixed, and probably biologically based feature of individual psychology. On this view, homosexuals constitute a natural kind, people who share an underlying property causing their same-sex attraction. This property exists whether or not a culture recognizes it. Ancient Greeks had homosexuals even if they lacked the concept. Essentialist claims support gay rights arguments that orientation is not chosen and cannot be changed through therapy or will. If people are born gay, then discrimination punishes them for characteristics as unchosen as race or sex. Research into biological bases of sexual orientation, including genetics and prenatal hormone exposure, supports essentialist positions. Social constructionism challenges essentialism by arguing that sexual orientation categories are historical products, not natural discoveries. Foucault's analysis traced the emergence of the homosexual as a species only in the 19th century Western medical discourse. Before this, people engaged in same-sex acts, but these acts did not define a type of person with essential homosexual nature. The sodomite was a moral category referring to sinful acts anyone might commit. The homosexual is a psychological category defining identity. This transformation was not recognition of something that always existed, but creation of new ways of being and classifying persons. Ancient Greeks had same-sex practices without having homosexuals in the modern sense of persons defined by orientation. Constructionism implies that different cultures organize sexuality differently, producing different kinds of sexual persons and experiences. What we call sexual orientation may be specific to modern Western societies rather than a universal feature of human sexuality. Some cultures distinguish active and passive partners rather than same-sex and different-sex attraction as the fundamental sexual difference. The Samoan fa'afafine, Brazilian travesti and Indian hijra do not map neatly onto Western categories of gay, lesbian or transgender. Imposing Western categories on other cultures may distort understanding of how sexuality actually operates in those societies. The universality of our categories is an empirical question that constructionism suggests should be answered negatively. Judith Butler's work extended constructionism from orientation to sex and gender themselves as performatively constituted categories. Gender is not expression of inner identity, but is constituted through repeated performances that create the appearance of stable identity. We do not have gender and then express it. We become gendered through ongoing acts that citation and repetition naturalize. This applies to sexuality as well. We become heterosexual or homosexual through performing those identities in recognized ways. Subversive performances, like drag, can expose the constructed nature of gender and sexuality by denaturalizing what seems natural. Butler's queer theory challenged both heteronormativity and gay identity politics based on stable minority sexual identities. The debate between essentialism and constructionism has practical implications for politics, law, and individual self-understanding. Essentialist arguments for gay rights depend on claiming that orientation is fixed and unchosen, warranting protection from discrimination. But this argument concedes that chosen identities might legitimately be discriminated against, which some find troubling. Why should legal protection depend on proving inability to change rather than on the value of sexual autonomy and diversity? Constructionist approaches suggest that political claims need not rest on essentialist foundations that may be empirically questionable. The right to sexual freedom does not require that orientations be natural kinds, immune to social influence or individual choice. Biological research has identified various factors correlated with same-sex attraction without establishing simple genetic determinism. Twin studies show moderate heritability. Prenatal hormone exposure may influence brain development relevant to orientation. These findings support some biological contribution without proving that orientation is entirely innate and fixed from birth. Sexuality likely results from complex interactions between genetic predisposition, developmental environment, and social context. Neither pure essentialism nor pure constructionism may capture this complexity. Interactive models may be more accurate. Philosophical analysis should remain open to empirical findings, while critically examining the conceptual frameworks used to interpret them. Contemporary sexual identity categories have proliferated beyond the traditional heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual triad. Asexual, pansexual, demisexual, queer, and many other terms attempt to capture experiences that older categories did not accommodate. This proliferation reflects both increased attention to sexual diversity and the desire for language expressing felt identities precisely. Whether these categories name real psychological kinds or function primarily as community-building labels remains philosophically contested. The political and personal significance of sexual identity ensures that debates about its nature will continue indefinitely. Philosophy can clarify the issues while recognizing that empirical and political considerations shape what positions seem plausible and desirable. Part 19. Evolutionary Psychology Examined. Evolutionary psychology applies Darwinian principles to explain human psychological traits as adaptations to ancestral environments. Sexual psychology has been a central focus because reproduction is so directly connected to evolutionary fitness. This research program has generated controversial claims about sex differences in mating strategies, jealousy, and attraction. Philosophical evaluation requires assessing both the empirical evidence and the conceptual framework underlying evolutionary psychological explanation. The foundational concept is parental investment, the time and energy organisms devote to offspring rather than additional mating opportunities. Because human females invest more through pregnancy, lactation and childcare, they should be choosier about mates than males. Males can increase reproductive success through multiple matings. Females cannot and risk wasting investment on offspring with poor genes. This asymmetry predicts that females will prefer mates showing signs of resource provision capacity and genetic quality. Males will prefer mates showing signs of fertility and will compete with other males for sexual access to females. Sexual selection has thus shaped male and female psychology differently according to the distinct adaptive problems each sex faced. Research claiming to confirm these predictions has found that men across cultures report desiring more sexual partners than women. Men respond more to visual sexual stimuli. Women attend more to indicators of status, resources, and commitment in potential partners. Male sexual jealousy focuses more on sexual infidelity. Female jealousy focuses more on emotional infidelity, threatening resource provision. These sex differences appear in survey responses across diverse cultures, suggesting they may be human universals rather than cultural particulars. Evolutionary psychologists interpret these patterns as evidence for evolved psychological mechanisms that differ between males and females. Critics have challenged evolutionary psychology on empirical, methodological and conceptual grounds that deserve serious consideration. The empirical findings are often less robust than popular presentations suggest, with significant cross-cultural variation and overlapping distributions. Sex differences in stated preferences may be much smaller than evolutionary psychology implies and may not predict actual behavior reliably. Self-report surveys about hypothetical scenarios differ from how people actually make sexual choices in their real lives. The methodological reliance on surveys, often of Western college students, limits generalizability to humanity as a whole. The reasoning from adaptive problems to psychological mechanisms involves speculation that is difficult to test directly. We do not know what ancestral environments were actually like, or what psychological traits would have been adaptive in them. Multiple different psychological mechanisms could have solved the same adaptive problems, so the inference to specific mechanisms is underdetermined. The flexibility and variability of human behavior suggests culture and learning play larger roles than fixed evolved mechanisms allow. Evolutionary psychology may overestimate the specificity and modularity of evolved psychological adaptations in human beings. General-purpose learning and reasoning capacities may explain human behavior better than numerous specialized evolved modules. The naturalistic fallacy warns against deriving moral conclusions from facts about evolution and natural history. Even if evolutionary psychology correctly describes evolved tendencies, it does not follow that these tendencies are good or should be indulged. Evolution has shaped capacities for violence, deception and selfishness that we rightly consider morally problematic and try to restrain. Male sexual promiscuity, if evolved, would not thereby be justified. Women's choosiness would not thereby be obligatory. Moral evaluation requires normative premises that evolutionary facts cannot supply regardless of their accuracy. Understanding why we have certain desires tells us nothing about whether we should act on them or cultivate different ones. Some evolutionary psychologists have drawn normative conclusions that critics consider ideological rather than scientific. Claims that sex differences are natural and inevitable have been used to justify existing gender hierarchies and resist feminist reforms. If men evolved to pursue multiple partners and women evolved to be coy, perhaps traditional sexual morality reflects human nature. But this reasoning ignores that human beings can and do override evolved tendencies when they conflict with chosen values. We are not slaves to our evolutionary heritage, but agents capable of shaping our behavior according to principles we endorse. Evolutionary psychology may describe starting points without determining endpoints for human sexual ethics and culture. The philosophical lesson is that evolutionary perspectives provide potentially valuable information without settling normative questions. Understanding the evolutionary origins of jealousy does not tell us whether jealousy is appropriate or how we should respond to it. Knowing that mate preferences have evolutionary origins does not tell us which preferences we should cultivate or discourage. Science describes, ethics prescribes. Confusing these domains produces bad science and bad ethics simultaneously. A mature philosophy of sexuality will incorporate evolutionary insights while maintaining critical distance from ideological overreach. We are evolved beings who can reflect on our evolution and choose how to live in light of, but not determined by, our origins. Part 20. Neuroscience and Philosophical Questions. Neuroscience has dramatically expanded knowledge about the brain mechanisms underlying sexual desire, arousal, and behavior. These findings raise philosophical questions about the nature of sexual experience, free will, and the relationship between mind and body. Neither reductionism that eliminates mind, nor dualism that separates mind from body adequately addresses what neuroscience reveals. Understanding the philosophical implications requires examining specific findings and the interpretive frameworks applied to them. Sexual desire activates the brain's reward system, particularly pathways involving the neurotransmitter dopamine in the nucleus accumbens and related structures. This same system responds to food, drugs, and other pleasures, suggesting that sex shares neurochemical mechanisms with other rewards. Dopamine creates feelings of wanting and motivation, driving approach behavior toward desired objects, including potential sexual partners. The intensity of sexual desire reflects the degree to which this reward circuitry is activated by erotic stimuli. Individual differences in reward sensitivity may explain variation in sexual motivation across persons and situations. Distinct from desire, pleasure involves opioid systems that create the subjective experience of enjoyment when rewards are obtained. Sexual pleasure during arousal and orgasm involves endorphin release that produces intense subjective satisfaction and temporary pain reduction. The hedonic hotspots in the brain, particularly in ventral pallidum, generate the pleasurable quality of sexual experience. Wanting and liking can dissociate. Addiction involves intense wanting without proportional liking, which may occur sexually as well. Some compulsive sexual behavior may involve dopaminergic wanting systems outrunning opioid liking systems, creating unsatisfying repetition. This neurochemical dissociation illuminates why sexual behavior sometimes fails to produce the satisfaction that motivated it. Attachment involves yet another system, primarily the neuropeptide oxytocin and its interaction with dopamine and opioid pathways. Oxytocin is released during physical intimacy, cuddling, and especially orgasm, promoting feelings of closeness and bonding. This hormone facilitates pair bonding in humans and other mammals, connecting sexual activity to lasting emotional attachment. Vasopressin plays similar roles, particularly in male attachment behavior and protective responses toward bonded partners. These systems explain why sexual activity can create emotional bonds, even when partners did not intend or desire lasting connection. The brain connects sex with attachment through neurochemical mechanisms operating beneath conscious awareness and control. These findings raise the philosophical question whether neuroscience vindicates pessimist or optimist views about sexual desire. Pessimists might argue that neuroscience confirms sexuality is mechanistic, compulsive, and driven by reward circuits rather than rational choice. The comparison to addiction suggests that sexual desire can hijack the brain in ways that undermine autonomous agency. Optimists might counter that neuroscience reveals sexuality as a complex integrated system connecting pleasure, bonding, and well-being. The oxytocin findings suggest that sex naturally promotes attachment and connection rather than objectification and exploitation. Both readings are possible. Neuroscience does not straightforwardly support either philosophical position over the other. The relationship between brain states and conscious experience remains philosophically contested despite neuroscientific advances. Does identifying neural correlates of sexual pleasure explain what that pleasure is, or merely identify its physical basis? Phenomenological properties of sexual experience, what it feels like, may not be captured by any amount of neurochemical description. The explanatory gap between objective brain processes and subjective experience persists as a challenge for materialist philosophies of mind. This does not require dualism, but suggests that neuroscience describes mechanisms without necessarily explaining consciousness fully. Sexual experience may involve more than what neuroscience can currently, or even in principle, capture about brain activity. Free will questions arise when brain mechanisms seem to determine behavior in ways that bypass deliberate choice and control. If sexual desire is dopamine release and approach behavior is triggered automatically, where is the free agent choosing to act? The timing of neural activity preceding conscious awareness of decision suggests that choices may be made before we experience making them. But this does not necessarily eliminate freedom. It may show that freedom operates differently than folk psychology assumes. We exercise freedom through developing habits, cultivating desires, and shaping the neural patterns that produce behavior over time. Immediate choices may be mechanistic, while long-term self-formation remains within our control and responsibility. Neuroscience also raises questions about enhancement, treatment, and modification of sexual function and desire. Drugs affecting dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin systems can increase or decrease sexual desire as side effects or intended results. Should such interventions be available to those who want more or less sexual desire than they naturally have? The existence of such technologies forces philosophical reflection on what normal and healthy sexuality involves. If low desire causes distress, treatment seems appropriate. But defining low desire pathologically risks medicalizing normal variation. These practical questions connect to theoretical debates about nature, normality, and the proper role of biotechnology in human life. Part 21. Philosophy of Love and its relation to sex. Love and sex are often connected in human experience and cultural expectation, but their relationship is philosophically complex. Different forms of love, Eros, Philia, and Agape, relate to sexuality differently, and some love may exclude sex entirely. Philosophers have debated whether sex without love is deficient, whether love without sex is possible, and what loving sexual relationships involve. Understanding these debates requires distinguishing types of love and examining their connections to sexual desire and activity. Eros, as Plato analyzed it, is passionate longing directed toward beautiful objects that can potentially lead to higher understanding. Erotic love begins with physical attraction, but properly directed ascends toward appreciation of beauty itself beyond particular bodies. This suggests that Eros includes but transcends sexual desire. Sexuality may initiate Eros but need not complete it. Romantic love, the intense focus on one particular person as uniquely important and necessary for happiness, descends from Eros. Whether romantic love always includes sexual desire or can exist independently remains disputed among contemporary philosophers. Asexual individuals report romantic attraction without sexual attraction, suggesting these can dissociate at least in some persons. Philia, often translated as friendship, involves goodwill toward another based on appreciation of their character and shared activities. Aristotle considered philia essential for human flourishing. Friends help each other become virtuous and share the good life together. Sexual relationships may include philia when partners are also genuine friends who care about each other's flourishing beyond erotic satisfaction. But philia does not inherently involve sexuality. The best friendships may have no erotic component whatsoever. The question is whether romantic and sexual relationships should include philia, or whether these are distinct relationship types with different values. Many believe the best sexual relationships combine erotic attraction with genuine friendship between partners who know and appreciate each other deeply. Agape, the Christian concept of unconditional love modelled on God's love for humanity, differs fundamentally from Eros and Philia. Agape loves the other regardless of their qualities, not because they are beautiful, virtuous, or beneficial to the lover. This love is gift, not response. It creates value in the beloved rather than responding to value already present. Agape seems incompatible with sexuality's focus on attractive qualities and the pleasure the beloved provides the lover. Sexual desire responds to perceived beauty and anticipated satisfaction. Agape would love, even if these were absent. Whether human beings can achieve agapic love, or only God can love this way, remains debated in philosophical theology. Irving Singer distinguished appraisal from bestowal as two components of love that operate differently in different love forms. Appraisal values the beloved for properties they actually possess: beauty, virtue, compatibility, and other attractive qualities. Bestowal creates value by treating the beloved as precious, regardless of their objectively valuable qualities. Romantic love typically combines both. We appraise our beloveds as having wonderful qualities while also bestowing special significance upon them. The bestowal component explains why we experience our beloveds as irreplaceable, even though others share their objective qualities. This analysis suggests that love involves both responding to value and creating it through the loving relationship itself. Union theories hold that love involves merging selves, creating a new entity that includes both lovers, in some sense. Aristotle said that friends are one soul in two bodies. Romantic love may involve even deeper union of identities and interests. Sexual intimacy can express and produce this union by dissolving boundaries between separate selves through physical merging. But union theories face objections. Lovers remain distinct persons with different interests, perspectives, and identities despite their bond. Too much emphasis on merger may threaten autonomy and individual identity that love should preserve rather than eliminate. Perhaps love involves tension between union and separation, intimacy and independence that cannot be fully resolved. Robust concern theories define love as deep caring about the beloved's well-being for their own sake, rather than for benefits to the lover. On this view, love is fundamentally altruistic. The lover wants good things for the beloved because they are good for the beloved. This distinguishes love from desire, which wants things from the beloved rather than for them. Sexual desire wants pleasure from the partner. Love wants the partner to flourish, whether or not this benefits the lover directly. Genuine, loving relationships integrate both. Partners desire each other sexually while also caring deeply about each other's lives overall. The challenge is ensuring that desire does not crowd out concern or reduce the beloved to an instrument for the lover's satisfaction. Sex without love is possible and common, but its value compared to loving sex remains philosophically contested. Some argue that casual sex is perfectly legitimate between consenting adults who do not expect or want emotional involvement. Others argue that sex without love treats partners as mere bodies, missing the interpersonal dimension that gives sexuality human meaning. This debate connects to broader questions about objectification, consent, and what makes sexual relationships good rather than merely permissible. Perhaps different people have different legitimate needs. Some flourish with casual encounters, while others require emotional connection. A pluralistic philosophy may recognize diverse forms of valuable sexuality, rather than insisting all sex must involve romantic love. Part 22. Commodification and Sex Work. Sex work, the exchange of sexual services for money, raises distinctive philosophical questions about markets, bodies, and human dignity. Debates involve competing values of autonomy, equality, protection from exploitation, and respect for persons as ends rather than mere means. Different philosophical frameworks, liberal, Kantian, Marxist, and feminist, generate different conclusions about sex work's permissibility. Understanding the debate requires examining the strongest arguments on multiple sides rather than caricaturing opposing positions. Liberal arguments for permitting sex work emphasize autonomy and the right to use one's body as one chooses. If competent adults freely choose to sell sexual services and others freely choose to buy them, why should the state prohibit this exchange? We permit people to sell other forms of bodily labor, physical work, sports performance, surrogate pregnancy, and organ donation. Singling out sexual labor for prohibition reflects irrational prejudice rather than principled distinction from other bodily exchanges. The harm associated with illegal sex work, violence, disease, exploitation results largely from criminalization rather than the activity itself. Decriminalization or legalization with appropriate regulation would reduce harm while respecting workers' autonomy and choices. Martha Nussbaum argued that the stigma attached to sex work is inconsistent with our acceptance of other bodily services. A masseuse who provides intimate physical pleasure is not stigmatized. Why should someone who provides sexual pleasure be treated differently? The answer cannot be that sex is special without explaining why this specialness justifies legal prohibition rather than personal choice. Perhaps the intimacy involved makes sex different, but we permit other intimate services like therapy without thinking they must be banned. Nussbaum concluded that properly regulated sex work could be a legitimate occupation with appropriate labor protections and worker agency. Opposition reflects stigma, disgust, and moralism rather than coherent ethical reasoning about harm and autonomy. Kantian objections focus on the impermissibility of treating persons, including oneself, as mere means to others' ends. Selling sexual access to one's body reduces oneself to an object for the buyer's use, rather than maintaining dignity as an end. The sex worker allows their humanity to be set aside during the transaction, becoming a thing that provides pleasure for money. This self-objectification violates duties to oneself even when freely chosen and harms no other person directly. The buyer also acts wrongly by treating the sex worker as a means to sexual satisfaction, rather than as a person deserving respect. No quantity of consent or payment can transform an intrinsically objectifying transaction into one that respects human dignity. Defenders respond that Kant's objection proves too much by condemning all wage labor that involves using persons for employers' purposes. The factory worker, the cleaner, and the security guard all sell their bodily capacities for others' benefit during work hours. If this is objectification, then capitalism itself is impermissible, which Kant did not conclude and most Kantians do not accept. Perhaps the difference is that sex is more intimate and identity-constituting than other forms of labor. But this claim requires argument. It is not obvious that sexual activity is more central to personhood than other activities we commodify. Different people may have different relationships to their sexuality. Some experiencing its sale as violating, and others not. Marxist and feminist analyses emphasize structural inequality that makes apparently free choices less free than they appear. Most people who enter sex work do so because of economic necessity, not genuine preference for this occupation over alternatives. The choice to sell sex reflects limited options created by poverty, lack of education, discrimination, and other structural factors. Calling this choice free ignores the background conditions that constrain it and make sex work the least bad available option. Legalization may legitimate exploitation rather than liberating workers, making it easier for buyers and employers to use vulnerable people. Addressing sex work requires addressing the inequality and poverty that drive people into selling sexual services they would not otherwise choose. The Nordic model criminalizes buying sex while decriminalizing selling, aiming to reduce demand while not punishing vulnerable sellers. This approach treats sex buyers as exploiters and sex workers as victims who need support services rather than criminal penalties. Critics argue this model stigmatizes sex work, drives it underground, and makes workers less safe by pushing transactions into hidden spaces. If selling is legal but buying is criminal, transactions become more hurried and less safe as buyers fear arrest. Sex workers themselves are divided on which legal approach best serves their interests, safety, and dignity. The disagreement among those most directly affected suggests that the philosophical debate cannot be easily resolved from armchairs. Deborah Satz analysed sex markets as potentially noxious markets that may be harmful even when freely entered. Markets in some goods undermine the conditions for democratic citizenship, perpetuate inequality, or violate norms essential for social life. Sex markets may harm women as a class by reinforcing the idea that female sexuality is a commodity available for male purchase. Even if individual transactions are consensual and beneficial to participants, cumulative effects may harm gender equality broadly. This argument does not require showing that each sex worker is harmed, but that the practice has systemic effects worth considering. Whether these systemic concerns justify restricting individual liberty remains contested among philosophers who accept the framework. Part 23. Pornography and Representation. Pornography raises philosophical questions about representation, speech, harm, and the boundaries of legitimate expression. Debates involve the nature of pornographic representation, whether it constitutes speech deserving protection, and what harms it may cause. Feminist philosophers have been central to these debates, dividing between those who would restrict pornography and those who oppose restriction. Understanding the philosophical issues requires examining arguments about pornography's nature, effects, and proper legal treatment carefully. Defining pornography philosophically proves more difficult than it might initially seem to anyone who thinks they know it when they see it. Sexually explicit material is not sufficient. Medical images and sex education materials are explicit without being pornographic. Material intended to arouse is not sufficient. Fashion photography and romantic films intend arousal without being called pornography. Perhaps pornography combines explicit representation with intention to arouse without pretense of artistic or educational merit. But this definition is contested. Some pornography may have artistic value, and distinguishing merit from pretense is notoriously difficult. Legal definitions have struggled with these questions, producing standards about community standards and serious value that remain unclear. The harm debate concerns whether pornography causes harm to women, to consumers, or to society that might justify legal restriction. Empirical research has produced mixed results on whether pornography consumption increases sexually aggressive attitudes or behaviors. Some studies find correlations between pornography use and acceptance of rape myths or sexual aggression. Others find no significant effects. The causal direction is unclear. Perhaps those already inclined toward aggression consume more pornography rather than pornography causing aggression. Even if correlations exist, correlation does not establish causation sufficient to justify restricting expression on harm prevention grounds. McKinnon and Dworkin argued that pornography does not merely depict but enacts subordination of women as a class. Pornography is not speech about subordination, but is itself a form of subordination through its production and consumption. Making pornography often involves actual coercion, abuse, and exploitation of women performers whose suffering is recorded and distributed. Consuming pornography trains viewers to see women as objects existing for male sexual use, affecting how they perceive real women. This analysis uses speech act theory. Pornography does something, namely subordinates women, rather than merely saying something about them. If pornography is conduct rather than speech, First Amendment protections may not apply, and civil rights approaches become available. Ray Langton developed this argument philosophically by analyzing how pornography might silence women's speech rather than merely harm them. If pornography shapes how men interpret women's communication, it may make women's refusals of sex less audible or intelligible to men. A woman says no, but the pornography-conditioned man hears this as part of the sexual script, as coyness rather than genuine refusal. This silencing subordinates women by undermining their capacity to perform speech acts like refusing sex that depend on uptake by hearers. Pornography thus harms not only by depicting subordination, but by making women's own speech less effective in the real world. This argument connects pornography to broader feminist concerns about who gets heard and whose speech counts in patriarchal societies. Liberal free speech responses argue that these harms, even if real, do not justify content-based restrictions on expression. The First Amendment protects speech we find offensive, harmful, or dangerous because suppression causes worse harms than expression. Government power to determine which ideas are too dangerous for citizens to encounter threatens democratic self-governance fundamentally. If pornography can be banned because it promotes sexist attitudes, other speech promoting disfavored attitudes becomes vulnerable. The cure of censorship may be worse than the disease of offensive and harmful speech in its long-term effects on freedom. Better responses include counter-speech, education, and changing the conditions that make pornography appealing rather than legal prohibition. Some feminists oppose anti-pornography positions from within feminist commitments to women's autonomy and sexual expression. Women consume, produce, and perform in pornography. Treating all pornography as male violence against women erases these women's agency. Some pornography is made by and for women, queers, and others whose sexuality-dominant culture marginalizes and suppresses. Restricting pornography historically has targeted gay and lesbian material, feminist health information, and art by sexual minorities. Alliances between anti-pornography feminists and conservative moralists suggest that restriction may serve patriarchal interests more than feminist ones. Sexual liberation may require defending pornography as one form of sexual expression, even while criticizing its mainstream forms as sexist. The Internet has transformed pornography's availability, raising new questions the earlier debates did not address. Pornography is now freely accessible to anyone with Internet connection, including children who encounter it accidentally or seek it out. The diversity of pornography has exploded. Whatever sexual interest exists, material catering to it can be found online. User-generated content blurs lines between professional production and amateur sharing, complicating questions about exploitation and consent. Virtual and AI-generated pornography may soon depict acts with no real performers, raising questions about harm when no one is actually depicted. The philosophical debates continue but must adapt to technological and social changes that alter the phenomenon being debated. Part 24. Jealousy, Exclusivity, and Alternative Structures. Jealousy, the painful emotion arising when valued relationships are threatened by rivals, pervades human sexual experience across cultures. Most societies have institutionalized sexual exclusivity, particularly within marriage, treating jealousy as natural and infidelity as wrong. But philosophers have questioned whether exclusivity is rationally required or merely culturally conventional, and whether jealousy deserves cultivation or critique. Alternative relationship structures like polyamory challenge monogamy's dominance and raise philosophical questions about love, commitment, and flourishing. Evolutionary psychology explains jealousy as an adaptation protecting reproductive interests that differed between ancestral males and females. Males faced paternity uncertainty. They could never be certain that children they invested in were genetically theirs. Sexual jealousy evolved in males to prevent female partners from copulating with rival males who might cuckold them. Females faced different threats. Male partners might divert resources and protection to rival females and their offspring. Emotional jealousy evolved in females to detect and prevent the emotional attachments that predict resource diversion. These evolved tendencies persist even when their original functions no longer apply in modern conditions with contraception and DNA testing. Even if jealousy has evolutionary origins, it does not follow that jealousy is good, appropriate, or something we should accept. Many evolved tendencies are problematic. Aggression, tribalism, and prejudice may have evolutionary explanations without being justified. The philosophical question is whether jealousy in sexual contexts is a reasonable emotion we should honor or an irrational response to overcome. Jealousy involves treating the beloved as somehow owned or entitled to exclusivity, which may conflict with respecting their autonomy. If my partner chooses to share intimacy with another, their freedom deserves respect, even if this causes me painful feelings. Perhaps jealousy reveals possessiveness that healthy love should outgrow rather than accommodate through exclusivity norms. Defenders of monogamy argue that exclusivity is not mere possessiveness, but constitutes the special value that committed relationships provide. By reserving sexual intimacy for one partner, we create something unique that cannot be replicated in multiple simultaneous relationships. The commitment to exclusivity signals and produces investment in the relationship that open structures might dilute or undermine. Children benefit from stable two-parent households that exclusive commitment tends to promote better than alternative arrangements. Monogamy may also protect against jealousy's destructive effects rather than merely expressing possessive attitudes worth criticizing. If jealousy is inevitable, perhaps structuring relationships to minimize its triggers is wise rather than foolish accommodation. Polyamory refers to consensual non-monogamy in which partners agree that multiple romantic and sexual relationships are permitted. Polyamorous relationships take many forms: hierarchical arrangements with primary and secondary partners, egalitarian networks, and others. Advocates argue that love is not a finite resource diminished by sharing. Loving multiple people need not reduce love for anyone. Compulsory monogamy restricts freedom and channels love artificially. Polyamory allows relationships to develop according to their own logic. Jealousy in polyamorous context is addressed through communication, processing, and compersion, finding joy in partners' other relationships. Polyamory requires emotional work but offers rewards of expanded intimacy, community, and freedom that monogamy forecloses. Critics of polyamory question whether it can provide the security, depth, and commitment that most people need from intimate relationships. Dividing attention among multiple partners may prevent any relationship from achieving the profound connection exclusive focus enables. The emotional labor required to manage jealousy, scheduling, and multiple relationships needs may exceed what most people can sustain. Children's well-being in polyamorous households remains understudied. The effects of complex family structures on development are unknown. Polyamory may work for some people with particular temperaments and circumstances without being a general model for human flourishing. The right arrangement may differ across individuals rather than being universal. What matters is finding structures that work for those involved. Philosophical analysis suggests that neither monogamy nor polyamory is rationally required for all persons in all circumstances. Different people have different needs, capacities, and values that various relationship structures serve better or worse. What matters ethically is honesty, consent, and genuine concern for all affected parties' well-being, whatever structure is chosen. Deception and betrayal wrong partners in monogamous and polyamorous relationships alike. The structure does not determine the ethics. Jealousy may be an emotion to manage, rather than either fully indulge or completely overcome, depending on circumstances and relationships. A pluralistic philosophy of relationships recognizes diverse legitimate forms, rather than privileging one structure as natural or obligatory. Part 25. Sex and Human Meaning. We have examined sexuality from biological, psychological, historical, and ethical perspectives throughout this exploration. The final question concerns what sexuality means for human existence understood in its broadest and deepest terms. Existentialist and phenomenological philosophers have argued that sexuality reveals something fundamental about the human condition itself. Understanding this dimension requires stepping back from particular debates to consider sexuality's place in human life as a whole. Human beings are embodied creatures who exist in and through bodies that are simultaneously ourselves and limits upon ourselves. We did not choose our bodies, yet we must live as these bodies in a physical world of pleasure, pain, and mortality. Sexuality confronts us with embodiment in particularly intense and unavoidable ways that reveal our condition as incarnate beings. The urgency of sexual desire reminds us that we are animals with drives not fully controlled by rational deliberation. The pleasure of sexual satisfaction shows that bodily existence can be good, not merely a burden consciousness endures. Sexuality thus discloses the ambiguous character of embodiment, both constraint and gift, both limitation and possibility. Sexual desire reveals our fundamental incompleteness and our need for others to achieve satisfactions we cannot provide ourselves. The experience of longing shows that we lack something essential, that we are not self-sufficient closed totalities. This lack drives us toward others who seem to promise completion, wholeness, or satisfaction of needs we cannot name precisely. Whether this promise can be fulfilled or whether desire is necessarily frustrated belongs to the disputes between optimists and pessimists. But the structure of longing itself reveals something true about human existence. We are relational beings who need connection. Sexuality dramatizes this relational ontology more vividly than perhaps any other dimension of experience. The connection between sexuality and mortality has been recognized since ancient reflections on Eros and the desire for immortality. Sexual reproduction creates new life that continues after individual deaths. We transcend mortality through offspring who carry our genetic legacy. But sexuality also reminds us of death, the petite mort of orgasm, the transience of pleasure, the aging of desirable bodies. Our sexual prime passes. The beauty that attracted desire fades. Eventually, the body that desired and was desired ceases entirely. Sexuality thus places us between life and death, participating in life's continuation while confronting our own finitude. This placement may generate both the intensity of sexual experience and the anxiety that often accompanies it. Sexual intimacy offers possibilities for transcendence that philosophy has rarely analyzed adequately, despite their experiential significance. In moments of genuine connection, the boundaries between self and other seem to dissolve in shared sensation and mutual presence. This transcendence differs from Platonic ascent toward abstract forms. It moves toward rather than away from embodied particular existence. The other person, in their concrete bodily presence, becomes the site of an experience that exceeds ordinary self-enclosed consciousness. Whether this transcendence is illusory or genuinely reveals deeper dimensions of reality remains philosophically contested. But the phenomenology of such experiences is real and significant, regardless of their ultimate metaphysical interpretation. The diversity of human sexuality resists reduction to any single meaning, purpose, or value that would exhaust its significance. Sexuality serves reproduction, but most sexual acts are not reproductive, and many people's sexuality excludes reproduction entirely. Sexuality expresses love, but much sexuality occurs without love, and some love excludes sexuality completely. Sexuality provides pleasure, But pleasure alone does not capture what makes sexuality significant for identity, relationships, and meaning. Perhaps sexuality is overdetermined, serving multiple functions, none of which fully accounts for its place in human life. The search for a single essence of sexuality may be misguided. Its meaning may be irreducibly plural and context-dependent. Philosophical humility is appropriate when confronting sexuality's complexity, diversity, and resistance to systematic understanding. The history of philosophy shows confident pronouncements about sexuality repeatedly overturned by changing knowledge and social conditions. What seemed obvious to Augustine, Aquinas, Kant, and Freud often seems parochial, prejudiced, or simply wrong from contemporary perspectives. Our own certainties may appear similarly limited to future generations with different experiences and conceptual resources. Philosophy can clarify concepts, expose assumptions, evaluate arguments, and illuminate phenomena without claiming final comprehensive truth. This critical and illuminating function is valuable even when, perhaps especially when, definitive answers remain elusive. Sexuality remains central to human existence, raising questions that matter deeply for how we understand ourselves and treat each other. Ethical questions about consent, exploitation, and respect remain urgent regardless of theoretical uncertainties about sexuality's ultimate nature. Political questions about regulation, freedom, and equality persist as societies debate how law should address sexual matters. Personal questions about desire, identity, and relationship confront individuals navigating their sexual lives in complex social worlds. Philosophy cannot answer all these questions definitively, but can help us think about them more carefully and honestly. This thinking is itself a form of Eros, the love of wisdom that Plato identified as philosophy's animating principle and lasting contribution. The journey through philosophy of sex ends where it began, with the recognition that sexuality poses profound questions about human existence. We are beings who desire, who seek connection, who create and destroy through our erotic energies and choices. Understanding sexuality requires drawing on biology, psychology, history, ethics, and lived experience without reducing it to any single dimension. The truth about sexuality is complex, contested, and ultimately inseparable from the truth about what it means to be human. Philosophy offers not final answers, but better questions and clearer thinking about matters that will remain important as long as human beings exist. The love of wisdom and the wisdom about love continue their ancient dialogue, unfinished and endlessly renewed in each generation.